All right, folks.
Where's the gavel?
Remind them. No, I'm not. I've never used the gavel. I'm not starting now.
You're not starting it.
All right, it's good to see a couple of folks in the audience tonight, apart from just the board. It is a couple minutes after 6 o'clock. It is my pleasure to call to order the Wednesday, May 7th meeting of the Freeport Planning Board. As usual, we'll jump right in. We have I think a long agenda tonight. So item number 1 is the information exchange. Kyle, you want to get us started on a report of items reviewed by the Project Review Board?
Sure. At our last PRB meeting, we had a few agenda items. We had 2 shoreline stabilization projects, which, as you know, the PRB or the Planning Board recently looked at an amendment that would be sending those to the Staff Review Board. That actually that amendment went to the council for its first read last evening. So that looks like it's on track to get passed. So these will probably be some of the last shoreline stabilization projects that go to the PRB. And then we also had a design review application for Brown Goldsmiths, their new location at 148 Main Street. They're putting in some new stairs and patio outside the building. And then the Town Hall front lawn project also was a site plan amendment and design review application. So there was an application approved there a couple years ago, but the project wasn't built due to funding. So the town came back for an updated revised plan there. So we moved forward with that.
When you say move forward, is there a construction timeline?
Yes. I forget what the exact timeline was. I think starting in summer, maybe. Caroline can correct me if I'm wrong. Okay.
Timeline is presumably out there somewhere in the public.
Yeah, I believe Earl or Albert said it was over the summer. But yeah, that was it for the items on the last PRB meeting. Item 2 is actually going to be Brett taking over for that one.
Great.
Hey everybody, Brett Richardson. I am the Development Director for the town of Freeport, and I'm here to share a quick update on the planning partnership initiative that we're doing with the DOT. And my PowerPoint doesn't appear to be working. That's okay, I can give you an overview. You want to see the duck or not? So the main DOT Planning Partnership Initiative, we are working with DOT on evaluating the Route 1 corridor, essentially from Maine Beer Company, north through downtown, up to Upper Mass Landing Road. So very consistent with the dog bone geography that we've looked at recently. The project, the way it works is the DOT puts up 50% of the funds, and the town puts up 50% of the funds. So it's a 50-50 cost share. I'm just going to talk to you guys. But it's locally led. So the good news is we get to sort of create the scope of work and pick the consultant. And I'm here to share with you tonight who we selected. So the RFP was open from February 26th through March 26th. We got 8 proposals, which is the DOT suggested is about double what most communities get. We got a nice cross section. And we ended up with a strong consensus on the highest qualified consultant, and that's going to be Stantec with Spec Dempsey. So if you guys have ever heard of the book Walkable Cities, that's written by a gentleman named Jeff Speck. He's a thought leader. I think it's the most widely purchased planning book in the country, and he's coming to Freeport. So that's great news, and we're going to start that work on June 17th with the community kickoff, where there'll be a presentation around the Transit-Oriented Development District. So they'll be looking at traffic flow on Route 1 in that area, multimodal connections, and they'll also be doing a build-out analysis within 1,000 feet of Route 1 to identify good footprints for development, and then sort of looking at how to tie that together with the coordinated development design for infrastructure and for amenities there. So good partnership there. We're sort of shifting from planning to design here. Stantec is really a strong traffic engineering firm, so we know that as we think about the vision, we'll have guardrails and engineering focus that will ensure that where the community lands with a vision is buildable. And the idea is that upon completion of the project in about a year or so, what we'll have is a great vision that the DOT and the town can then jointly pursue funding for implementation. So it's really sort of shifting from visioning into design and hopefully capturing dollars to do construction and implementation. So good partnership, good response. We're really excited about who we are going to be working with. And the council last night at their meeting authorized the contract, which was signed today. So we're off and running.
Great. Thanks, Brett. I have two questions. First, very simple. You mentioned June 17th, which is a Tuesday, as a kickoff.
Yep.
Is there like a public-facing event?
Yeah, exactly. So the council last night were scheduled to adopt the budget for next year on June 17th. They've shifted their meeting to June 24th. So we're going to be we have to figure out the location, but it perhaps could be at the High School Performing Arts Center. Apparently Jeff Speck will show up and draw 200 people on a random speaking engagement. So we think that if we can promote this well, we'll get a strong turnout from Freeport, but we'll also have a good opportunity to bring people to Freeport and showcase the planning work that we're doing and the vision that we have for the future. So it's potential to have some good PR for all the work that you guys are leading us on.
6 p.m.?
6 p.m., June 17th. Hopefully we'll have a save the date out here in the next day or two once we pin the location down. And they'll be up here. I really wanted to be here tonight to let you guys know that this is going on, and they'll be doing community outreach over the course of the scope of work.
Great.
I got a question too. Yeah, I assume the answer to this is yes, which is that their traffic analysis and study is going to be done on the basis of a build out.
Yeah, I mean,
Because I think, yeah.
Yeah, from where I said, it's pretty exciting because we've got this basis now with the dog bone. They're going to do that build out analysis, and then they'll use 50-year. They'll do the planning for the transportation network on 50-year build out projections.
Good.
So concerns about congestion, we'll have a chance to.
I'm sure there will be some, so this can help.
Yeah, we'll have a chance
solve the
to
problem.
anticipate those and manage them. And then in addition to that, we anticipate that we'll be engaging with Bernstein Shear shortly to commence work on the Transit-Oriented Development TIF district. So we're going to knit together the transportation plan, hopefully with funding mechanisms that allow us to have the resources to implement.
I would point out, this is all very exciting. I would point out this is on the draft comp plan implementation table. This is 3.1.3. Dovetails very nicely with redesign Main Street. And also this will force me to keep my mouth shut about redesignating Route 1 off of Main Street.
Well, it's on the table.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to make clear, too.
Is that on the table?
I mean, I think it's
Will they consider that?
worth a shot.
Maybe I'll rephrase it. I'll leave that concern to much better qualified people than me to make that argument. So,
But what's really relevant for this group that I want to leave you with is that, if we want to maximize the potential of that area and have the resources to fund the amenities that we want to see in that area, then the zoning needs to be allowed for more density, right? Those two go together. And the current zoning, when we do the build-out analysis, we'll probably, ramp that up to allow for greater density so that we can see what it is. But that's a conversation that we should continue going forward around what that looks like so that our plans and projections are based on where we're going to be.
I don't know how long you're planning to stay tonight, Brett, but you may be
I'll be here for the duration.
very soon.
Thanks very much.
Next sub-item is, sorry, I've lost my proper window here.
Comp
Comp plan. Update on the comp plan.
Yeah, so I don't think there's too much to update here. I mean, the comp plan is been sent out to the state for review after the planning board and council signed off on that. And do you know how long it's been since we did that? We have like another month and a half maybe of wait time probably on that.
Yeah, we're anticipating Ben Smith, North Star Planning. We're not anticipating to hear back from the state until end of June timeframe.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you'll see later on the agenda that we're going to try to start talking about some kind of work to do out of the implementation table alongside some of the other things on our work plan leading up to that in the meantime, where we can start doing some work and prep of the comp plan coming back and actually starting that formal adoption process.
Was
yeah.
this attached to the submission to the state?
Yes. Yep. So, yeah, that's pretty much it for them.
Great. Yep, as Kyle said, we're going to try to make use of this time where we're in a bit of a holding pattern to get ready for, make sure we can hit the ground running when we do have a fully approved, updated comp plan. Unless anyone has objections, I'll move right along, or we will move right along to item number 2, which is a discussion with North Star Planning regarding the design review ordinance update. And I'll turn it right over to North Star, who have generously brought some slides and prepped us for some discussion tonight. Oh, Caroline is
So
going to.
Caroline's just going to give a brief intro
fair
before
enough.
North
Yep.
Star starts.
So we've been talking about design review for quite a while, so we thought it would be good to start with a little overview of how we got to where we are tonight. So a lot of us have been talking about updating design review for over a decade. But right after COVID, we worked on the downtown vision, which kind of brought this topic to the forefront, and there was community support to be looking at updating the design review ordinance. So back in April 2024, we issued an RFP for a consultant to come forward and help us update or redo the design review ordinance. We wanted something that would reflect our community wants and desires with clear standards, streamlined review process, and new and modernized site and building design standards that would reflect what we wanted, in particular, keeping the downtown vision in mind. So we sent the RFP out kind of with a clear objective. There were 4 tasks that the consultant needed to complete. And the approach, if you might remember, we sent out to RFP. The first part of it was for them to kind of do an analysis of our current design review, the overlay, look at the downtown vision and the underlying zoning. And then they were supposed to kind of lead us through the community outreach, which you might remember, we had a series of joint workshops with the planning board, project review board, council was invited. They've done tabling at events, they've done postering to get feedback, and they've done small stakeholder groups to get feedback on design review. So this RFP was really set up for them to hear from the boards and the council as to what their desires were, what they wanted the ordinance to look like, and then to hear from the community, business and residents and property owners to get the feedback they needed to work on standards. So they have been plugging away with all the other projects on the design review ordinance behind the scene. We've had some conversations with them, but there are some policy decisions that they need some guidance on. Policy decisions are why we have boards. It's really up for the 7 of you to give guidance. At this point, where it really is an ordinance writing project, or that you guys will more be reacting to, we're keeping it on the planning board track, but you will notice that you do have some project review board members here tonight who were interested in this project. So they're looking to get some policy guidance from you tonight so that they can finish up draft 1. It was then envisioned they would come forward to you with a first draft to reflect everything they've heard so far in this process, and then we'll carry that to the finish line. So just wanted to recap as to why we haven't seen them in a while, what they've been up to, but I'll turn it over to Kate so she can hit the ground running and they can get the information they need from the board tonight. Thanks.
Yeah, so I last saw you all a while ago, a few months ago. And in the meantime, we've been sharing some draft language with staff and kind of going back and forth. And as we work towards a first draft that we can present to you, we had kind of a list of questions that Freeport staff felt like really needed to be board discussions that they didn't, that they needed you to help answer. So our goal for tonight is really to just go through these questions. have a conversation and get some answers. And some of them are things we've talked about before, some of them aren't. It's a pretty wide range of topics, so I'm just going to jump in. I've got some slides up mostly just so we can have some visuals to guide us. So the first question, we've talked about this with staff as well as with the boards about eliminating the Freeport Village Overlay District, and that those standards should either be incorporated into zoning where that makes sense or into design review if they belong there. And so, sure. Pick here. Okay. Sorry. So currently on the map, the design review districts are what's in purple. Does everyone see that? And then the village overlay is the yellow around that. Does everyone see that? So the question, I think we talked about this a bit at a previous meeting, but the question we want to define here is if we get rid of the village overlay, should the design review districts, should that just go away and design review district stays in the purple? Or should the design review district kind of be combined and expand to encompass all the yellow?
Or someplace in the middle.
That's also a possibility.
My thought on this is basically that the overlay district should go away. The design review district should stay where it is. And if there are pieces of the overlay that we like and want to keep, then the zoning should match that in the yellow area. So like if there are things that we want to keep in the, like, I don't know, sidewalk or streetscape or whatever parts of the overlay district as it exists today, then it can be incorporated into zoning. But I don't, and the specific piece is I don't want to extend review, like additional review steps outside of what is currently drawn. That's where I am on this.
Yeah, it should be just very clearly highlighted that when we say or talk about the idea of getting rid of the overlay district, that doesn't mean that every single piece or standard within the overlay district needs to disappear. There are things in there that tie into setbacks, like, that could probably better fit.
But if we were to remove them, we'd have to do a little checklist of all those things and
we'd
get
want-
them into the zone.
Right, we'd want to go through and pick and choose what's worth keeping. And then once we establish what's worth keeping, there are design standards in there. There's landscaping standards in there. There might be a setback standard in there. We would pick and choose, like, okay, we want this, we want that. Is it best put into the space and bulk standards under the specific zoning district in the zoning ordinance? Or is it best put into the design review ordinance? Or is it just, is it best to get rid of it entirely? But just to, be clear, if we say, talking about an idea of getting rid of the overlay district as a recommendation, that doesn't necessarily mean every single one of those standards disappears.
Sorry, I just want to piggyback off that. That was one of the things I left out. When we sent out the RFP, we know we have a lot of challenges downtown Freeport with all the layers of zoning. And so we knew that this was focused on design review, but the fourth task of this was for the consultant to look at overlay and whatever we weren't encompassing into this geographical area and make recommendations of things we need to fix, which is kind of what Kyle is talking about. So giving them directive here is fine. Whatever way you land, it was expected that this one ordinance wouldn't fix all of our problems and they would give us another to-do list. So don't be shy in sharing your true feelings because that was the expectation of this project.
I think to echo what Sam said, the number one priority I would have is to not have two things. And so it has to go away somehow. And now the question is what exactly are lost in the design overlay district, and if you can fix it all by zoning, that seems fine. And the only other question I have is, I'm not sure I know every detail about every boundary there, but I wonder if there's, if the design ordinance has, for instance, historic preservation components that are stricter than you would put anywhere else, you might want to change the design ordinance boundaries a little to grab that street. I don't know if that's bad or good. I mean, I heard what Sam said and sort of agree that you don't necessarily want to add new burdens to people that they didn't have before, but so it takes a detailed review is what I'm thinking to just
Yeah.
make sure we don't throw baby out with
I
bathwater.
think, so the purple is the current design review boundaries, which was set after it was scaled back from
your
what it was, say, 18 months ago, maybe a little more than that. I don't remember the exact timeline, but the Central Core Working Group, if anyone remembers the Central Core Working Group, that was another working group that existed in town roughly, again, 18 months ago, did a review of the design review boundaries, recommended lopping off a pretty good-sized chunk south of the railroad bridge, and I think we left everything else as is. And so that is basically the existing design review district, with the exception of that that area south of the railroad bridge. My sense is that area captures the sort of I hesitate to say highest value, but let's say most visible parts of town
Right.
that are the most impactful or the most sort of the most valuable in determining the quote unquote character of downtown. And so I feel pretty comfortable with the way that is. I think the parts that, are sort of close but not not part of the existing purple are like East Street and, parts of
Park Street, the end of Elm Street.
yeah, and I think, I don't think that the design review district should go beyond, go beyond Frostbrook north to, those are mostly residential neighborhoods. The speed limit is 50 up there. Like, that's not, we don't need to be regulating that part of town more than it is currently. And like I said before, I think to me, the important part is the additional review step, right? And that's the part where I think if we're going to impose the additional review step, we need to be really targeted about where we do that. And if there are parts of the like placemaking that exist in the Freeport overlay district. So like if there are parts of the Freeport overlay district that we like and we want to encourage, that's well and good, but we shouldn't be imposing an additional review step. And so that's where, yeah.
For sure.
So that's kind of, so it's a very long way of saying, I like it the way it is. I want to get rid of the overlay, the extra overlay, but I don't want to expand the boundaries beyond where they are now.
So if I can recap, what I'm hearing is, for the purpose of this, oh, sorry.
I just wonder if there are other opinions.
No, I actually very much agree with what they're saying. The only thing that I would suggest further, and it sounds like this was already looked at and taken away, would be to protect that lower Main Street down to like Shaw's, Route 1, that area. But otherwise, get rid of the Village Overlay District. I like these boundaries. Match them, I think it's a good opportunity to match them to parcels.
Do they? I think they do.
That's the intent, is that they do. And if they don't today, that as part of all of this, that we make them match.
If you could point out where they don't, that would be.
Yeah, we are mapping it to using the parcel map, so,
Good.
Looks like it to me.
So you'll adjust it slightly.
yeah.
I'm generally in favor of anything that reduces burdens and simplifies rather than confuses people with two districts, so I believe that would be consistent with what Sam initially proposed. So I would concur with that.
I just want to make sure we can eliminate some subjectivity when we get at the end, so we're not
That's the
arguing
main,
over whether it's, plastic wood or wood or cement wood, or,
I think that's coming up on another page, but yes, here.
Yeah, and I'm all for, sitting down with a list of these things and where they go. I think that's a good idea, that we sit down with a list of what's in the overlay district. I'm all for eliminating whatever we can to, not throw the whole thing out, but just make it work better, because it's not working real good now.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, we can have a follow-up discussion as we move along with maybe an overview of the Village Overlay District and talk about what standards the board thinks are worth keeping.
Would apply to those streets in the yellow, but not the purple.
Because the way that ordinance is broken down is, certain sections apply to certain levels of projects. There's a few standards that apply to residential projects, and then there's a few more that apply to commercial projects, and then there's some streetscape standards that apply to, bigger subdivisions and things. Some of those rarely ever come forward and just haven't been relevant over the years from what I've heard and picked up on. For instance, the VC1, which is a huge component of design review, doesn't follow the village overlay standards to begin with. It's exempt from the village overlay standards. It only follows design review, even though it's within that geographical boundary of. So all the points about it being kind of confusing for someone to look at. Yeah.
I think it'd be a big help for us if we had a good plot plan map out here. And then, Kyle, you could give us a little, okay, what do we do? What happens to an applicant in this district? And how many layers does he have to go through? So we can actually stand there and look and say, okay, what's going on here? And, how does this work? How many things does he have to do first? And then when he hits the overlay district or whatever happens, so that we can sit here, because it's up to us to make the recommendation, what we slash and what we keep. So I'd hate to, they want some direction, but in the end, it's up to us to make that, cut, so.
So what I'm hearing is we'll keep the boundaries as they are for the purposes of our updated ordinance. We have kind of a next steps memo that's going to go along with that, and in that is a recommendation with some detail about basically how the Freeport Village overlay standards the ones you like should be absorbed into other ordinances, and then the overlay should go away to make things easier. And then finally,
Are you going to comment on what, are you going to do any look at what?
Broadly, but we're not giving you, we're not rewriting that one. And then we do have our historic preservation consultant did go parcel by parcel in both of these areas, as did the person who was contracted in 2019. So there will also be, another thing you'll get will be a parcel list with any recommendations that the previous consultants had said maybe this should or shouldn't be.
Basically reclassifying anything.
What needs to be reclassified, yes.
Anything that is.
And that would be a public process that you'd have to go through for the property, so we can't just, kind of include that in here, but that will be one of the next steps.
Yep.
All right. Should I keep going?
I think so.
All right. Next up, exemptions. We have proposed adding an exemption for small structures, saying that structures 200 square feet and under should be exempt from design review. So we want to know what you think of that and if that's a good threshold. I put some pictures here just to help people visualize what 200 square feet is. It's like the off-the-shelf shed that you can get at Home Depot is like 200 square feet. 400 square feet is like the size of a tiny home. And then 600 square feet is like a 2-car garage. So hopefully that helps people.
So can I just give a little background?
Yeah.
So currently, how we would look at this is in design review, any material change that's visible from a public right-of-way would trigger the need for review. So we do have some exemptions, if you're replacing a window or a door with a like window or door or something like that. But for instance, if a 200 square foot shed went up currently and it was, at the end of someone's driveway, but as you're walking by on the sidewalk, you could look down that driveway and see the shed, that would trigger the need for design review. So that's where we currently are. So this is really,
Go for it, Mitch. I have a little laundry list of.
Oh, you could go first if you want.
Sure. I think they're pretty quick. First, I would support something like this, and I think 200 square feet is a pretty decent threshold. The questions, I think we should clarify that the 200 square feet applies to the footprint of the structure. I wondered, sort of idly, so I would put this question to the board, should we think about a height restriction so that somebody can't build like a 200 square foot, 3-story tower? Not that I think that's likely, but I could see like a tiny home that's 2 stories, and maybe also, my third question is, should there be a setback where this is exempt? So like, if it's on, if it's right on the property, or not right on the, if it's right up against the existing setback, so say the existing setback is, I don't know, 15 feet, right? If it's right on that setback, then clearly it's much more of an impact in this zone, a visual impact. So should we impose an additional setback and say like, all right, if you're putting a shed in your backyard and your backyard is 50 feet back, maybe that doesn't trigger design review, but if it's within, I don't know, 25 feet of the public right, or 50 feet of the public right of way, then it does trigger the sort of typical design review that it might trigger today. So put a setback in there, basically, to buffer. Does that make sense?
I mean, you clarify it with a single-story, non-inhabitable structure. I think maybe, I wouldn't want to see a home of any kind, tiny or, shed-sized home or whatever, without design review. I mean, a shed, I think somebody should be able to plop down a garden shed on their site without going through a bunch of hoops. But I think if you're getting into a home or garage or something like that, it should. So to take care of your, just make it a single-story structure.
16 feet was my suggestion. So thinking like, all right, if it's 10 feet wide and it's got a little pitch on it, then
Yeah.
that's about 16 feet.
But yeah, otherwise, I'm in agreement, Sam.
Is that something that could be handled at staff review instead of coming for
So design review,
these smaller things instead of making them go to the board and jump through hoops? I mean, everybody ought to be able to have a garage.
I mean, right now, the proposal, you guys are proposing like a completely exempt level for something like this. And then if it doesn't meet that threshold, it would go to project review board. We do have some projects under the current design review ordinance that are on that in-between level where there's staff review, doors and windows.
We're going to talk about that next.
Yeah. Right,
Yeah,
there's a few
so-
other things. So it is conceivable that we could say like, all right, the 200 square foot and under 50 feet back is totally exempt. You can do what you want. If it's 400 feet, it's staff review. Like, we could add that additional level. I think for now, I'm pretty comfortable with just you're either exempt or you're not.
yeah,
and you
so
gotta go
staff
PRB.
review currently doesn't bring in much
Design.
design review. It's more of
Judgment.
a
It had to
check
go
to
to
make
them.
sure nothing has changed. So for instance, like the doors and windows piece, I can staff approve something if it's a one-to-one change, just a pure replacement. So basically, from the staff review perspective, I'm just checking to make sure that there's no change with what they're proposing versus what was there before. Staff review currently for design review doesn't involve looking at something new that wasn't there before and making a determination if it meets the design review ordinance. That being said, if we're making more prescriptive standards across the board where it's easier to say, yes, it meets this standard, it meets this standard, and there's less subjectivity built into the ordinance talking about visual compatibility and things like that, then maybe it is an option.
So as I understand it, these would be exempt from design review?
No,
Only
only
the
the 200.
shed.
Only the shed, okay, because it said exemptions. Now, what you're talking about a 400 square foot tiny home, but we've made an ADU available on any lot.
Right, but
It's 1,100 square feet.
So it's allowed as a land use, but that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't still have to go through design review.
this has to do with
I know that, but you're
design.
saying, you got a 400 square foot tiny home here that's says exempt here, or at least the shed.
No. She's showing you 200, 400, 600. She's proposing that we exempt 200, and then she's asking the question, maybe you want to exempt 400 or 600 too.
Is that correct?
Yep, the pictures are just to illustrate how big a 200, 400,
I see.
how
So-
big these things are.
Okay, I got you.
I have a couple of comments. First of all, I can't talk about this subject without saying that I think the best solution to the design ordinance would be to repeal it. But assuming that the goal is to have a design ordinance, I am aware that among the things that I personally would consider eyesores in town are small structures. And so it doesn't seem right that you're going to try and design the look and feel of this area and exempt something on the street that could be hideous. So, but I believe that Sam had the right answer, which is if it's 50 feet back and it's 200 feet, I don't see, maybe even bigger if it's back. But you know.
How many lots would be affected by this? How many lots in town got enough room to go 50 feet back?
A lot.
Is that right?
I mean, I think if we're talking about a shed, I mean, my house.
Your house is in the district and has that
Totally,
room.
yeah.
You got enough depth to get back there,
Oh,
meet
yeah.
the setbacks, and
So I just want to clarify that in the overlay, an accessory structure can be 5 feet from some of the property lines. The 200 feet, one of the most awkward questions I get as staff, or used to get as staff, is when somebody comes in and standing at the counter with the code officer and they say, what do I need for a shed? And the code officer says, nothing for me, no building permit. And I'm like, but you gotta go to design review, because up to 200 square feet, something that's purely a shed is exempt from permitting. So they don't have to give building plans or a plot plan. In the rural zones, I just wanna remind you that we actually, it's not for design review, but it might go to some of like Sam's concerns. We have a special standards for sheds that they can be closer to the property line. And that's not why I'm reading this, but to tell you what the parameters are for when it's applicable. And so we allow, for the purpose of this section, a shed is defined as a structure that's no greater than 200 square feet with a building height of no more than 12 feet, and that's solely used for the storage of property, not shelter for animals, people, or passenger vehicles. So that is some language that we have in land use, that if you were concerned about a shed and you wanted a threshold, you could use some consistency, and I'm reading that from page 55 of the zoning ordinance.
Is that in the definitions section?
No,
or is it
these are in the other standards in the rural zones, because again, we have this special definition of a shed because we give them reduced setbacks, but it sets that small structure threshold language that you
That
could.
seems like something that should be moved into
Very-
the definitions and then referenced.
Well, you have the power, not me.
That's pretty far down the priorities list, but yeah.
So for what it's worth, that's just another reference point that you could,
Yeah.
Kinda
I like that.
utilize
I think
the
that-
same wording.
That speaks to Dave's concern too, and I think Mitch makes a great point that small structures can have a big visual impact. And so if we're going to exempt them, then we should do it with that in mind and do a step. I mean, 50 feet may not be big enough, actually.
as somebody sitting on this side of you, maybe Kate and Ben don't feel this way, but I'm hearing a lot of mixed opinions and not sure the full consensus of the board. So anyone that has thoughts that hasn't shared it might be helpful to hear your thoughts. So where do you land on this?
I'm in favor of exempting it. Do you know if most other towns in the area regulate these 200-foot structures?
I don't think you typically need a building permit. I did
We
look
don't,
in-
but who has a design ordinance? This is really about design
Yeah.
ordinance.
I think, I'm trying to remember what Portland just did in their recode, and I don't know it off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note that, I mean, even in other districts in Freeport, we might not regulate. This is specifically because, of
You
the
have a
design
design
review
ordinance.
ordinance in this area.
No, I think
so,
I think Mitch makes the right point. If we're going to be regulating the way downtown looks, then
And how could you, and I mean, I think it might only be 25 feet. I'm not even sure if something.
So the way I've seen it done in some other places is that if it's that like something like a shed of this sort wouldn't be allowed to be placed like in front of the principal structure. But, so maybe you don't put an actual number.
Oh, as long as it's
not-
set back.
Yeah, as long as
10
it's
feet
kind of
back
like a
from this-
secondary feature where
Right.
it's, placed kind of slightly behind the
Chance of
single-family
problems.
home or something, it's
That is
not quite
small.
as noticeable. Maybe you can still see it from the right of way, but it's set back beyond the home or something, and so that could be
do like,
something. explored.
25 feet behind the primary facade of the principal use or something like that.
Yeah.
Principal structure.
I like that
We
a
have to make
lot.
sure those terms are defined, of course. But I get the sense that Ford has something he would like to add to this, and I would love to hear your opinion, Ford.
appropriate?
Yeah,
No,
totally.
it's, I was going to ask you
Yeah,
guys.
Okay.
and I should have done that earlier too. Given that we have some members of the PRB here, if you folks want to stand up and say
Comment,
stuff,
please.
please do it.
Thanks.
Just
I've reviewed
introduce
it.
yourself as always, and we're
Great.
good.
I only have two really minor comments on all the materials you're going to look at tonight. Speaking for myself, I'm Ford Reiki, the chair of the PRB. And I've shared them with Sam, shared them with Kyle. On this topic, I heartily support broad delegation to staff. I think we have a talented staff, and we are using them appropriately for that. I'm also in favor of simplifying design review. There's one thing here, and I think Sam's comment addresses my concern, but I still want to point it out to you. We have very small modifications come to us for review in design review. If someone's going in even looking forward, I think if someone wants to change their front door completely, they come to us. And I think we're opening up a situation where someone's going to come to us and say, I'm trying to put a stone wall in front of my house or change my front door. I'm here in front of the PRB, but I could build a building as half the size of this room, and there's no review whatsoever if we do this. So I'm in favor of it, but there's still a lot of other things that have a very low threshold.
So you're saying we should increase the threshold on other things or reduce it on this?
I'm in favor of this. I think Sam's idea of setting it, make sure that it's set back far from the road, I think will help us limit the situation where people are objecting to.
The public interest is the streetscape, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. So I think the setback helps overcome that concern. Thanks.
I'm just, in reality, how many people are going to put a shed on the front lawn?
Probably nobody, but that's
But it's worth.
Yeah.
I understand, but I'm just saying, are we?
I mean, there are some, if you drive around town enough, you notice there are some boat sheds right up against the road. There are some things that.
Well, around town, but not.
Right, but
in
I
this
think
area.
the point is, like, if I am very much in favor of limiting the scope of the review, but if we're going to have an area that is reviewed, then we should review it in a way that makes sense and is appropriate. So I think
I can see if you want to push it back behind the front facade.
Yeah.
So it's not between the front of the house and the
Yeah,
sidewalk.
that's always,
That's, I
I
can deal
think
with
that's
that.
a simple, measurable, objective thing to say.
and then you can
Yeah.
go ahead.
So
right.
what I'm hearing is that we're okay with the 200 square foot threshold, since that's also the building permit threshold in Freeport. But we'll want to make sure there's some language in there about how this is for like single-story, non-residential, accessory structures, set back from the principal building, or some
The
more
design
defined
ordinance
language
doesn't
there.
apply as long as it's set
Exactly.
back.
So is everyone in agreement on that?
Good.
Okay, cool.
I mean, it's interesting to note there is some residential on here.
So
On South Street, on Dennison, and Bow Street, on Maple.
I'll just point out, we do have, so if you take a look at our village overlay, okay, just for like a similar language. So in the village overlay, there's a subsection for garages, and there's actually language in there that say garages must be set back at least 4 feet from the front of the primary structure.
4 feet.
Yeah. Now, that's just talking about garages in general. It's a hard standard that's saying, when you have these single-family homes anywhere in the village overlay district, that's not saying it's, exempt from review or part of the review. It's just saying, your garage has to be set back from the primary structure a little bit. But it's an example of this concept of setting an accessory structure slightly behind the home that we already have existing here. So.
Are you guys, do you want more guidance than this?
Is that
like
good enough?
Hard numbers, or are you good?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, cool.
Good. Next.
All right, next, so we'll continue with exemptions. So there's a lot of words here, but on the one side, you see the current ordinance exempts a lot of things currently, including replacing your siding or your roof, roof-mounted solar panels, replacing deck boards, replacing handrails to meet building code or ADA, door hardware, mailboxes and house numbers, and fences less than 5 feet. We talked a little bit about this earlier, which is that we were discussing basically getting rid of staff review, and either you're exempt from design review or you go to the PRB. And the idea was just to make it easier for people, especially doing projects like a shed that don't require a building permit, that they don't have to then go to design review. So if we were, the main things that are currently reviewed by staff are replacement doors and windows. Is that fair to say, Kyle?
Yeah, currently it's the replacement, the doors and the windows, and then the other big thing is signage,
Yep.
which.
We're not going to talk about signs.
Yeah.
So we would propose that we would exempt replacement doors and windows of the same size and style, regardless of material, from design review. So no staff review, you just get to replace your window.
On the face of it, that seems really sensible. Like, if you're just really replacing it, like, why would that trigger any review by anybody? But you say of identical size and style, and I wonder who decides.
That's why this is on here for discussion.
So that's that's kind of what we highlighted, right? It's,
Yeah.
you know, it'd
That's
be,
why staff review, if you just check off.
Right, it's-
It doesn't apply to design review as long as it's identical size and as the staff checks it off, you know, and then you just say, oh, yeah.
staff
it
is essentially confirming
confirming
that it's true.
That it's true.
Right. But in an ideal world, you know, right, it'd be great to just say, you know, you're allowed to do that. You know, you don't have to take that step to check in. You know, there are loads of other cases and examples where people are permitted to do something, you know, and a project around town of any kind of scale, and, you know, they have the option of doing something that they're not technically allowed to do. But, you know, and if that happens, then we take action and we say, okay, you know, no, you did something that wasn't part of your approval, whether it's a building permit or a site plan approval or whatever it is. And, you know, we retroactively go in there and say, you know, no, you have to fix this, whether it's getting an after the fact approval or, you know, taking
So
it
I
out and putting it
suppose,
back in.
yeah,
So it could
hate
be
to-
done that way, where it could be more of a, you know, and after the fact, you know, we realize, oh, you replaced that window, you never got design approval, you changed your windows, it's not a direct replacement, you need to go to the board now to
I
do
mean,
it.
it seems like staff review would be, you know, the in-between there, rather than letting somebody fail, you know?
Yeah, I hate to let people fail. That's what I'm thinking about. Is that
That's
you
why
come
it's
in
here
and-
for the board.
Nobody will be surprised to know that I have thoughts on this.
And I mean, you know, and it's like, and to Ford's point, you know, what else can we add to this exemption, you know, into a staff review type of a?
So if you have to replace a window now and you live downtown, what do you have to do? Can't you just call up the guy and say, I need a new window?
Nope. You got to go to the Kyle and say,
I can't fix my window? I gotta come down and get a
Well,
permit?
great question. There's a difference between fix, and once again, like my house is the perfect example of this because I have very old windows, and in some cases we have restored them,
Yeah.
and that does not require a permit, right? Because we're fixing them. We're not we're just doing maintenance, and even if it's extensive maintenance and they get taken out and reglazed, whatever, painted a different color and put back in, that's okay. There's no permit required. But if we're going to replace a window, then we need a permit, and it's a design, or not a permit, but a design review certificate, I should say. It's not a building permit, but it's a design review.
So you don't need a permit, you need a ticket from design review.
Yes.
Right.
So a couple of things that so I'm very much, and I'm kind of in the middle of this in my house. So one thing, I am in favor of the exemption. I think we could do some clarifying to make it easier to have the design-minded among us stomach the exemption, and make it easier for homeowners to follow along with this. So the existing design review language, and I know this because I just looked it up the other day, says when the existing windows have muntins, the existing light pattern shall be maintained with true or simulated divided lights. And there's also a parenthetical statement in there that says that it's not just simulated divided lights, they have to be physical muntin bars on the exterior of the window. You're welcome, Ford. And there is a difference there, right? If it's simulated divided lights and it's just the grills between the glass, there's a big difference in how that looks on the exterior. So if we're going to regulate this and if we're going to exempt it and people want to make that distinction and care about it, that is an important thing to keep in there, is that parenthetical statement. I have a funny story about this if anybody wants to know.
Which means it
later.
has to be an exterior.
Yes, it has to have an exterior physical. It doesn't have to be a true divided
It
light.
could be
Like it
a
can be
piece of plastic grill, but it's on the outside.
Outside, not the inside.
Right.
Or
Not those
both.
flat
Yeah.
things that they put in the middle.
Yep, yep. And the best replacement windows, I think, the best replacement windows that aren't true divided light have all three. They have an exterior bar, an interior bar, and the grill between the glass, so you can't kind of look through the middle. And that's the best way to get the look. So if we're going to proceed with this exemption, which I support, that parenthetical statement, in my opinion, needs to be in there. So that's number one.
What it means to be identical size and stuff.
And then number two, I think if we want to kind of drill down on what it means to be the same size, there is a technical difference between an insert replacement window, which goes So it means you like in an old home with old double hung windows, you pull the stops, you pull out the old sash, and you put in an insert window, and then you put the original stops back on. You don't touch the exterior trim, and their insert window fits into the old opening without having to remove any siding, any exterior trim. You can do it quickly and relatively easily.
But the rough opening gets smaller.
Because not the rough opening, the glazed opening does get a little bit smaller. Yeah, but the window fits inside the existing opening. So yeah, it looks a little bit different, but they are designed, the manufacturers design them to look as similar as possible to the original window. It is also usually the most cost-effective way, because the other alternative is putting in a new construction window, in which case you are changing the rough opening, or you might be changing the rough opening. You're probably replacing some siding, or you're patching siding. That's a much bigger and more expensive project generally. So if we want to make that distinction and have this exemption, that's, I think, a relatively easy way to say it is the same size if you're doing an insert window and you aren't touching the original trim. So if we want to add that language, I think that adds the specificity and the protection for homeowners too, to say, this is how you know it's the same size. If it's an insert, it's the same size. Does that make sense?
I think it does.
If you can word it right.
Yeah, and if it's not an insert window and you're changing the rough opening, then it's not the same size because you're changing the rough opening. So that's my 2 cents. And the doors.
Sometimes you can't replace things identically. It's just not even an option. So you're close, but no cigar.
So if we were close but not identical, what harm are we seeking to prevent?
I think we are seeking to say, lower the barrier for somebody like me who just wants to replace some windows without going to town hall and paying a fee. And then the other threshold is just, you can do what you can propose something that fits with the design standards. You just have to get it approved within this narrow part of town where we care about these things. And that's the only, if you want to put in a bigger window and you think it looks great and you want it then you just go make your case to the PRB. Generally, the PRB listens, and the standards are.
Or even, I guess it would be PRB, not staff review.
Well, this question might be beyond the scope of what we're talking about tonight, but I question to what extent we care about changes. I mean, there's a limit to how far something has to be to start to care about it, I think.
Totally. Yeah. However, I think if we do, we've had the discussion many times, and I think there are people in town who do care about design review. And so with the sort of baseline assumption that we care about design review and we want to keep design review in place, how can we work within that framework to lower barriers for certain people in ways that are objective and reasonable? And then
make it obvious what is allowed and what is not.
Yeah, exactly. And if it's not, if it's not exempt, then that doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you have to go to the PRB first.
What's your comment?
That's really getting back to the original purpose of the RFP, was to update design review, not scrap it, but how do you make it easier, more clear for people to use it, administer it, and understand what the end results need to be?
So can I ask kind of the board collectively, are people comfortable with moving forward with 2 very specifically written exemptions for replacement doors and windows, or do we feel more comfortable keeping it on the staff review side of things? I know what Mitch thinks, but what does everybody else think? I want to hear from you too, Mitch. I just want to make sure we're
Exactly
here.
the same. I've got no problem with that, yeah.
Anybody else?
I wanna
I
make-
just
I
don't
wanna
want to.
make-
I don't want to lose his asterisk.
Yep. No, yep.
I have it typed up too if you want it.
I'm not so concerned with all these little, if somebody wants to change the door. Most people that got an expensive house downtown's not gonna put an ugly door in it, so, and if it's a little bit different, it's their house.
My comment about doors is actually, I'm fine with it the way it is, but like in my case, I have a door from the 70s that's a slab panel, and I want to replace it with something that looks a lot better. And I actually got a permit to do it a few years ago, and then of course I didn't do it. So now I have to go back and get another permit. Excuse me. But anyway.
Just don't tell anybody you didn't do it.
I don't know well, now you all know,
So you shouldn't have said anything and just done it.
Let the record show.
So I think
They'd ask forgiveness and permission.
I think But I think it's fine. It would be hard to write that in a way that would be able to just, like, if the goal is to regulate and require approval for design like this that impacts, you know, if the reverse were true and somebody wanted to take a nice door and go to a slab and we didn't want to allow that, then, so, anyway, long way of saying, I'm fine with it the way it is, the door one.
Rosemary?
I'm fine.
Okay. Everybody's fine with it? So we're going to make these more specific in how they're written, but move forward with exemptions and not having staff review for this. All right. Well, now let's talk about something different. Roof pitch.
I feel even more strongly about this one. Brace yourselves.
Sam, did you write like a manifesto?
Oh, but yeah.
Yeah, you've got
Well, I got so I haven't had a computer. This is like my previous laptop is from 2009, and I haven't used it in years and years. So that's what you get when I get a.
So we heard pretty strongly in the public outreach that there is a preference for pitched roofs. We've also heard that from previous PRB projects. However, we also feel like, especially for larger buildings, it's good to have a range of options. And the current ordinance is written so that you have to be thinking about what the surrounding buildings' roof pitches are, which is helpful, but sometimes not so helpful if it's like, you know, a site that doesn't have a building next to it, or if you're building a very large building and the only thing next to you is a little pitched roof. So our proposal is to say that the use of pitched roofs is highly encouraged. If you use a pitched roof, it must be a minimum of 6/12 or greater on single-story buildings, or 4/12 or greater on multi-story buildings. And then if you choose to use a flat roof, if the horizontal roof line is more than 50 feet, there must be breaks in the roof line to mitigate the building mass. So to look at the pictures, the ones on top are roughly a 6/12. So those are 2.5-story buildings. On the bottom, you see a picture of a random larger building with to show you kind of what I mean by on a multi-story building that 4/12 looks different. Like if you had a 4-story building, you don't want a 6/12 roof pitch because then that's going to be huge. And then the final one is to show what we mean by breaking the roof line on a flat roof.
I'm in favor of it. Sounds good to me. Sam?
see the manifesto.
Yeah, no, it's not really a manifesto. It's really just the 4/12 pitch thing. I really dislike shallow roof pitches. I've said this before publicly, so I don't want to go on too long. But I think by requiring or by encouraging a pitched roof and then laying out 4/12 as the minimum, I think you get you tend to get these wide buildings with a 4/12 pitch, which really just looks like somebody drew the simplest building they wanted to and then put a 4/12 pitch roof on it because they had to, not because it actually would look better. So I think on a bigger building in a more urban setting, or maybe urban is, but more let's say downtown, like New England downtown setting, I think a flat roof on even a 2-story building is actually more historically appropriate in many cases. So I think if we want to encourage a particular look, I would be much more in favor of requiring something like a cornice detail. Like you can't just have your roof go like this and then straight over with no overhang. So if we want to encourage a particular look, I think that is going to be a more impactful way to do it. And I also think that a lot of builders would probably prefer that to having to put a 4/12 pitch. You know, if you have a flat roof, you have a place to put your heat pump condensers. And if you have a cornice detail, that's not the worst thing because that hides them from street view and gives you a little bit of drip protection. So now your bulk water management is much easier for your windows. So like we are getting a few things done at once with that sort of requirement. I think 4/12 as a requirement should go away. I do really like the breaking up the facade. I think that makes a big difference. I'm okay if it's maybe a little looser than 50 feet or if there's more flexibility. I don't really know how to write that, so I don't want to suggest anything. But I think generally gable roofs are great, but they can be, if they are required, I think it can pretty quickly go awry because,
And I don't even know what highly encouraged means.
yeah.
It's like they
Yeah,
are.
it becomes tough so if we're talking about, one of the points of the RFP, right, is to make things simpler and clearer. And, we talk about staff being able to give good guidance to applicants up front, right? The language like encourage or
Correct.
it creates, it's hard to give a good expectation to the applicant.
And it's going to lead to the 4 and 12 pitch. I mean, I just wanted, every word he said is correct.
So would it sound better if we took out the sentence about the highly encouraged and just say, if you do a pitched roof, it has a minimum 612. If you do a flat roof, you need to
That's
break up the roof
breaks.
line. And, we do actually have some language about other architectural details in the ordinance that I didn't bring tonight. So,
Like Cornish lines.
yes.
I'll say when we talk about the village overlay too, that 6/12 is another one of those standards that is built into the overlay. So that would be an example of carrying over something that doesn't exist in design review currently that adds a little specificity.
Yep. I think, honestly, the reason why we put the 412 thing in there is because that is, people in Maine like to build those bigger apartment buildings with the lower pitched roofs. I'm not saying they're my favorite thing, but that is what gets proposed in a lot of places.
I mean, the picture that or the rendering, maybe AI rendering there is
Google
not the
image
worst,
search.
right? Because the long eaves are eaves, right? Or the long facade is an eave, and then the shorter ones are the gables are small. What we often see, I think, driving around is that people take the long facade and then just put this never-ending 4 and 12 pitch, and it just does not look good.
Except, I mean, I hate to remind you, but when you go this side of Main Street, down on that other side, and even on parts of Main Street historically, a 4 and 12 pitch was pretty common. All the shoe shops were 4 and 12 pitch. I mean, there was buildings on Main Street at the turn of the century that had a 4 and 12 pitch or a flat roof,
Yeah.
And the only ones that really had gables were homes.
That's where I think a flat roof is,
But-
a good.
I'm not upset with any of these. I'm just not scared of that kind of architecture, so.
Yep. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Jason?
I didn't mean
Jason wants.
Yeah, Jason, you have something you want to?
Thank you. Yeah, Jason Donahue. I'm part of the project review board. And on the subject of roof pitch, I think the underlying intent behind that is carrying forward a more traditional language in the construction of buildings. And it gets complicated for me when we get into these non-traditional types of buildings, like large complexes, and then starting to create this roofscape, which suddenly starts to feel very artificial, because usually there's like a flat top to the occupied part of the building, and then the roof's going on top of that, and it could really be almost anything. It's the nature of modern construction, right? For the simplicity of it and the production of trusses off-site and the fact that they come in quick, and I understand all of that, but I think where it gets less appealing is when that roofscape starts incorporating false dormers and chimneys or elements that just are not real elements of the architecture as it's experienced by occupants of the building, and it's there for essentially a kind of decoration. I don't know if there's a way to address that in the looking at this roof pitch question, but I think that would be interesting to find a way to have something as a review of projects to push back on when we start to, which I'm sure we will, get applications that show a roof line that starts to get silly, right? And then it becomes not traditional. It becomes so disingenuous that you start to want to find ways in scale and mass and proportion and rhythm and to try to dissuade that from happening. But it just, in a way, we don't really have a lot to work with. So that's my thought.
Trying to think how
What's the suggestion?
other than like a
No false front.
no false
No
dormers.
false, right.
Pitch, no
Yeah.
false. No, that's all.
Yeah, well, I think this, it typically gets more into height, which we're not regulating in this. That's going to be a zoning thing, but there, you can include standards like that. It has to be occupiable stories. So if you're say it has to be, between 2.5 and 4 stories that are occupiable. So that means not like a fake upper story. So I took a note that, we can look at if there's any other language we can put in that basically says don't slap a fake chimney on top of
Right.
it. So is the board in agreement that we should move forward with something that says you can do a pitch of 612 or greater or a flat roof with a break at least every 50 feet and other design features that are not named in this
We're going to
slide?
eliminate the 412?
That's what I'm asking. Are we okay with that?
I don't think so.
I don't think
Okay.
so.
That's going to eliminate, that's, no, I don't.
Okay.
I mean, I think you should look at the project, see if it looks good.
But that's the subjectivity part.
that-
And we do have another comment from the public. I don't want to
Yeah.
gloss
Oh,
over as
sure.
well if there's, yeah.
Really here for the campground meeting, but I'm Ted Crooker, from Cedar Havens, I guess. But as a contractor and as a builder, and mostly in dirt work, because that's what I did for years, the biggest problem I feel with the 612 is snow and where it goes and how it builds up and how it's a real maintenance problem when you have ice jams and things like that. You got to be thinking about that. I do enjoy the 412 because I think there's less, the wind takes care of a lot of that. So you have to take advantage of things like that you have out there. I really enjoy a fake one because I live at Cook's Corner and on the Storer Road, and the Cumberland Farms there has a completely second story that's completely fake. There's nothing there, but it looks wonderful. And it has the windows and everything there, like there's something there. I wish there was an apartment there, because I think for a builder, you'd be, maximizing, you'd have somebody in the site that's policing the site, that lives there. But I do think you really need to consider a 4-season climate. And I think all these are good, but I would never build that one, because I think you'd be looking at a lot of ice jams.
Yeah, I mean, if you have gables that are, like the U-Haul building I always think of driving by in Portland, then yeah, certainly. But I think, there's plenty of, when people think of the vernacular architecture in New England, a lot of people think of a 12-12, right? Steeper roof pitch. So, it's a tough thing. Maybe the simplest way to address my concern is just not to say that gables are highly encouraged, not to require them and let people design things that look decent. What I really don't want to see, not to pick on Cook's Corner now that it's come up, but there's those buildings in Cook's Corner that I think I've mentioned before that really, to me at least, look like somebody required a gable roof, and so they put a gable roof on these very tall
That was his
buildings
comment.
that aren't. It doesn't look right, at least to me. So I'm not going to die on the 412 hill, but I also think that flat roofs are appropriate downtown, and I would much rather see a requirement for some detail around the roof line, like a cornice, than.
So do we want a minimum roof pitch at all, or should we just?
No,
I have no preference. no,
All right,
no.
great. Well, so we will focus instead on design elements and get rid of the pitch minimum.
I'm okay with that. Yeah.
yep.
I'm just going to take some notes. Okay, so next one is building materials. So I think in the current ordinance, it does not list specific materials and instead requires visual compatibility with nearby buildings, which is very vague into what that actually means. So I know in the past the PRB has allowed, your simulated clapboards, shall we say, no matter what they're made out of. So our ordinance was going to be explicit about that and say that you can use traditional materials such as brick, granite, slate, clapboard, shingles, or contemporary materials simulating clapboard, shiplap, or shingles such as vinyl, cementitious or fiberboard, asphalt shingles, or engineered wood. So really being specific that you can use the wood thing or the modern material. The question we had is there are some places where they have a higher standard for the street level primary facade. So like your facade along Main Street, say. So there are communities where they say on your street level, like where a person is walking, first floor has to be those traditional materials. So I guess the question here is, are we okay with being specific that we allow contemporary materials or wood, or do we want to have a higher standard on the first floor? I put some pictures up from some that we had taken that show. The top one is all, I don't want to say fake, it's not fake, all contemporary materials. And the bottom one has some granite and wood as well as some vinyl, I think, worked in.
I had a little bit of wordsmithing on this one. I think generally speaking, I'm fine with this, but again, I have like a technical distinction on vinyl in particular, not generally a big fan. For me, the thing that makes vinyl either acceptable or not is when the seams are stacked on two courses. Drives me totally insane. So if there's a vinyl product that doesn't stack the seam on, adjacent courses, that makes me feel okay. And if it is, then I'm not okay with that as a blanket.
I think one of the
approval
tricky
thing.
parts about regulating materials is that a good installation of vinyl
Makes a huge
looks
difference.
great,
Yeah.
and you wouldn't tell from walking by. But
It's-
unfortunately, in an ordinance, you can't require, hey, install this well.
Yeah, install it well. And it also, it is vinyl, there are tons of there's different manufacturers, there's different thicknesses, there's different patterns on it, there's a million ways, there's different details where it's like, is it just vinyl siding, but it butts into wood trim that has a little rebate on it? Or are you using like the stock profiles that come from the vinyl manufacturer that are meant to be installed as fast as possible? And there's a huge difference in how that looks.
Wavy.
So it's a tough one. I would err on the side of caution. I don't know how the PRB feels about reviewing like that level of detail of like, what is your vinyl installation going to look like? Are you using the vinyl corner board or are you butting it into PVC? I don't know. I see three people out there who are psyched to weigh in on this.
Jason Donahue again, Project Review Board. I'll keep it brief. If you took vinyl out, that would be great. They're just like in the whole subject about like what is good or not good, mostly not good about vinyl.
And
That's
what
my
happens,
opinion.
So if somebody wants to use vinyl, this isn't a question necessarily just for you, Jason, but if a builder said, hey, I'm excited about this project, but it really only works if I have vinyl siding on three sides of it, say, I want to go to the PRB to get my approval, here are the reasons I think it works. Do we allow that, or does it not? If by excluding vinyl from this list that exists in the design review ordinance, are we sort of saying by default then that you can't use vinyl? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
That'd be the point.
What would that do to cost if you couldn't use vinyl and you have to use?
Potentially.
That would be very.
Well, that's the problem we run into is like people come in and say, well, we're not using another material because of cost, and then we get stuck in this cost argument that really we shouldn't be stuck in.
I think, yeah, and I think that the middle ground that we could consider is that sort of first level, street level facade of a higher quality material.
Or why just the first level? Why not the whole? I mean, it depends on scale, I guess, of course, but
Yeah.
I'm worried about the front facade as opposed to the other sides, much less worried about the rest of it.
Well, any facade that's facing a public way, I guess.
But I think the risk you run then is you get in, you have, to me, it jumps out more if you have clapboards on the front and then vinyl that's meant to look like clapboards but doesn't quite on the other sides. because that could be interpreted different ways. Like if an architect sees that and says, okay, we need to break up the facade in a way where the transition between different materials makes sense and looks intentional, that's one thing. But if it's just like, okay, the whole building's gonna have clapboards, we gotta use wood on the front, we gotta use vinyl on the sides, that's a different thing where it almost, like the difference between the two, where one is the real thing and one isn't, it almost makes it look like okay, that's not intentional. Somebody made them do that in that way and they just took the cheapest, easiest way out. And I think that's less desirable to me. But it's very hard to regulate.
I'm trying to figure out how to write it in a clear way. Right?
Yeah, it's very hard to regulate the
Jason,
like.
that's more.
I mean, I feel like
Please.
if vinyl could just disappear, then we'd all be better off. I know.
I don't disagree with that.
It's harder than to do that. Than,
Another, Caroline, since you're standing right there, maybe you know the answer to this in addition to whatever else you were going to say. How many buildings do we have downtown right now that have vinyl on them?
So I think we do have some. I think, like you said, vinyl of 1983, when we had the ordinance, versus vinyl of 2025 installed correctly, is very different. With commercial structures, I do think we see a lot more of alternative materials, such as composite, because they last better. I was trying to think of times where I can think if someone's coming with all vinyl. And there's a couple things that pop out to me. They were longer ago. We have had a few cases where vinyl was not accepted on the front facade, or the facades facing the road. It was only accepted on the other facades. But I'll give you the flip side. So when we talked about the buildings, one of the things Kate pointed out, we were talking about 1 and 2 families, is we actually do have quite a few single families in this district that are contributing to the downtown and have maintained their historic character. So we did a number of years ago have a residential property that came to the board, and it was sided in vinyl, very charming, sided in wood, very charming. He wanted to go fully vinyl. The board was really having a hard time finding that compatible, so they didn't approve it. It was tabled, and he never came back. So if cost is truly a factor, consider the flip side is that someone's just going to keep the wood that's falling apart and is super expensive to get painted and maintained. But I do think we are primarily seeing it more on residential or smaller, because all the big stuff I can think of, like composite. I'm looking at you guys in case I'm missing an example. But that's the downside. I do like being clear. We keep getting in trouble because we haven't been clear. And it's much easier to have these tough conversations now and make the tough decisions and have a clear.
I mean, I think another like sort of similar example to that with a different spin is the house next to me, which was sort of that situation, except they did cover it up. It's no longer contributing, maybe because they covered it with vinyl a while ago, but all they did was like slap vinyl over it, and now the vinyl is failing. And so now you have failing vinyl over failing wood, and like the whole thing is just failing.
I think
So it's like, you know, I know the cost question is a tough one. Like, how can we really require people to spend more money on their properties? But at the same time, I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. And the design review district is requiring people to spend more money
now
on
too
their properties.
is you have visual compatibility. And so like in the area where you guys are on North Main Street, I think there actually is some vinyl. I think people have come in and been like, oh, my neighbor has vinyl. But then in other cases, if something's not close by, but again, we're trying to get rid of that vague threshold of visual compatibility.
Yeah, this
So-
standard currently in the ordinance is not worded very clearly, right? I mean, a building's materials contribute to its architectural significance and should be visually compatible with nearby A and B buildings. I mean, what if there are no A and B buildings nearby, first of all? It just doesn't give a lot of guidance. So I do feel like anything we come up with here is going to be more clear than what's currently there.
I'm not upset with vinyl siding, but, because I understand that, you know, at some point, you're a certain age and you want to tighten up your house, and you can't afford to have the whole thing stripped and boarded on, sheathed on the outside, and, you know, it gets No. Well, what are we really trying to do here? I mean, I know what we're trying to do, but then we get to the point where, okay, are we going to deny this person to tighten up their house with vinyl?
So one other thing I'll throw out there that's not in here, but something we can consider is that so in our draft ordinance, which you haven't seen, so I know this is slightly confusing, but we have some additional kind of higher standards for like commercial and big multifamily buildings versus like single family homes. So we could allow your 1 and 2 family homes to use vinyl and not those bigger projects. But at the same time, I think that from having some conversations with developers, people were definitely open to the idea of using traditional materials, brick, clapboard, whatever, like on the primary facade or the first floor, but obviously materials are a way that people love to save cost. So this is the balance here. If we say no vinyl, then we are, losing some of that.
So if we're hearing from developers that a sensible compromise is prioritize the street-facing facades, and if it's an option to allow vinyl for 1 and 2 family buildings, maybe that's a sensible middle ground. Does that seem reasonable to the board?
From what I'm hearing, there are so many individual situations that could arise that I would not be in favor of a universal prohibition on any material.
Yeah.
And, you can't, if people have wood clapboards, that doesn't mean they're going to paint them and it's not going to be peeling. I mean, you can't really ensure the appearance of the downtown or any neighborhood. So, yeah, I would just not want to prohibit anything.
So do we want to think about having a stricter standard for the primary facade, or do we want to just?
I think we should.
Yeah, I think that
Does
gets
everybody agree on that?
That's what we're trying to
The
achieve.
design ordinance, didn't you say earlier that the design ordinance is public-facing, only affects public-facing? Somebody
That's-
wanted to put something in the
That's-
backyard
Yeah.
that nobody could see.
The current
they could
ordinance.
do whatever they want, right?
Yeah, so the current
Existing
ordinance is as it visible from the public way. So
That could be a
in
lot.
general, that's what is regulated, but you, like for a new, I don't know, if someone built a new apartment building on Depot Street, say, that would go through design review and you'd be looking at all 4 sides of that building.
Yeah, also, but also if someone, there are situations, where, you have a corner lot or, there are situations where you could see onto the backside of buildings, and just because it's on the backside.
But that's
doesn't
why
mean
isn't the
it's not visible.
standard, wouldn't the standard as it's, assuming you follow the way it's written now and what it applies to, wouldn't it allow, even if you said no vinyl, wouldn't it still permit vinyl on the other sides of the building? That weren't, if it's corner lot, not on either of those, but if it's not a corner lot, then we don't.
Proverbial backside of the barn.
Under the current system, if it wasn't visible, but that's not necessarily the system that'll be carried forward.
Well, I'd hate to think that this applies to anything that isn't visible, because what's at the public's
This applies to
interest?
this is for like new construction or significant additions. So
But does it
this-
specify that it's
Even
only
then,
street facing?
yeah, even then, why, if there's a new building on Depot Street, and Depot Street and Mill Street, those are public facing, but then they have a back and they have a garage, take the building that was originally gonna be there, and it has a back and then a garage, what is the design ordinance care about those facades?
Does
I mean, the zoning should
the
care,
question,
but-
because we don't have a draft, like a public draft of it, how does the new draft treat that situation?
Applicability.
Is the applicability for anything in the district or anything in the district and visible from a right-of-way, public facing?
So I think for like a brand new building, I think it would, like, in the design review process, they'd be telling you what they're doing with the whole building.
Why does the design review ordinance apply to the backside, unvisible side of the, what is the public interest in that?
Well, there's different standards for like a primary facade and a secondary facade. So,
Are there any standards of design? No, I don't want the whole thing.
Yeah.
But why is there, what is the public interest in the back of the building?
I think this is hard to discuss without having a draft and applicability in front of us. So I think,
Maybe we have to come back to that when you.
yeah, I think largely what I'm hearing here is that we're potentially in favor of being stricter with materials on the primary facade of the building.
On the public visit.
Yeah, so the primary is like public, facing a public
Clear.
street.
But I think that's a defined term, at least in the existing ordinance.
Yep.
Didn't we? In fact, I remember spending quite a bit of time
Yeah,
trying to
so
define what
primary
is the
facade
primary
is
facade.
the
Yeah.
facade facing a public street with the main entrance. In the case of a corner lot, a building may have two primary facades.
Okay, then we're good.
Yep. That was actually when the Central Core Working Group did its sort of overhaul of the design ordinance. That was a sticking point or a point of confusion that had been in the ordinance for quite a long time that we tried to resolve, and it's hard to make it perfect, but anyway. All right, so I outlined a couple minutes ago kind of like a middle ground here. Does that make sense to everyone?
I'm with Wayne. I'm not worried about it.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'll say that
Trying
from
to
the
decide and it keeps the house warm.
applicability thing, we're going to have a check-in before coming back with a draft. So we can take some of the feedback on some of that applicability, see how that might fit in, talk that over, and then, whether it's coming back to the board with the draft and having a recommended option, or it's having a couple options, we can kind of figure that out.
Does anyone from the PRB who's here have any feedback on that way of treating vinyl and what was the other question? The middle ground was basically allowing vinyl on single family and two family, maybe. I think that's kind of where we
Let's just say residential.
residential. Well, but that could include large multifamily, which may be in
How many are
I
there
see your
downtown?
point.
How
Yeah.
How many are there
We could
downtown?
say like 1 to 3 is like your smaller residential, and then 4+ becomes multifamily.
Yeah, I don't know that we want a 60-unit vinyl building.
Right. That's kind of where, like, if the point is to regulate the visual, the character of downtown, I think by allowing, say, 1 and 2 or 1 and 3, whatever, that's splitting hairs. But you're sort of like limiting the quote unquote visual damage that could be done to the character by there's only so big within reason that a single family home could be within the downtown. And so we're saying, okay, if we're going to allow vinyl in these situations to be respectful of people's budgets and desires as they're updating their houses or maintaining their houses, but in the case of a larger project, that's what we're trying to regulate. And so we're going to regulate a larger project by requiring this higher standard on the primary facade. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Okay.
This all makes sense, except let's argue the other side for a minute. Is that prohibition on vinyl on a big building, which I understand from a design stance why we would want to, is that going to prevent a big building from getting built?
I don't think so. I spoke to several developers.
They're all
who did
using
the interviews,
cementitious
and
board.
They said, first floor, if they basically said if they had to use it, that's fine. The only person who doesn't like that standard is is someone doing affordable housing projects, which are typically done in vinyl. But that's kind of a bigger.
Yeah, but the biggest building we got in downtown is Bell Beans. It doesn't match any of this stuff.
No.
So,
Well, it's shiplap wood
on an angle,
on an angle.
Yeah.
with no overhang and a flat roof,
And no windows, yeah.
Yeah.
and no muntins and no one,
Correct.
so, that's why I don't get too upset about this stuff.
Yep. All right, I want to move on from this one.
So are we comfortable moving forward with the middle ground as described by Sam, and this can be further refined potentially later?
Just for the record, I was trying to, wasn't just my idea. I was trying
As
to
explained
find
by
that.
Sam.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say, if this was to preclude an affordable housing project, that's not a good thing. And I think we should reconsider if that's really the case.
Yep, I agree.
I'd like to move forward with it that way
Yep.
for now. I think that's the right mix. But I think we have a little bit of time before.
One question is there, if you're very specific that those things are allowed and then they can sail through, but if somebody wants to do something that isn't on there, then it would go to the PRB and there would be some judgment call? I mean, maybe that in other words, is there some?
That's kind of what I try to get at. I think like the very first question I asked is like, what happens in a case where somebody has say somebody has this like crazy modern idea and they say, well, yeah, I respect your cornice thing, but for these reasons, I think that.
And we think it's going to look great.
Yeah.
Then it would seem like you want some judgment call about yes or no.
I think
But
very early on in the process, we heard, I think from the board as well as from staff, that there was not an interest in having waivers in the design review ordinance. What you're describing sounds like a waiver.
So, I mean, waivers seem great because it allows flexibility to handle all these.
then you're
issues.
right in the same place we've been.
Then everyone asks for a waiver, and right, you're just back to a very subjective ordinance where.
And everything
So
gets
the
appealed.
village overlay does currently have a waiver for standards like what you're talking about. Design review, I don't think does, but at the same time, there aren't really prescriptive standards in design review, so everything's kind of up for argument under design review currently. So just, yeah, in the ideal world, it's great, but it does create some issues in practice for sure.
I mean, I think, and I don't think it would not necessarily preclude the development of affordable housing. Affordable housing has a lot of complex, moving financial pieces, and potentially there could be other ways where if you wanted to move forward with this in the ordinance, you could think about other parts of zoning where like fees can be waived and other things could be, other financial incentives could support affordable housing while also still requiring things like this. Does that make sense? Like, there's kind of a lot of different.
Exactly, because it costs money somehow. You're
can
adding
move-
money to the
I
project. so
suppose you
could
could
go
exempt capital A affordable housing out of
We're-
this.
That might be a discussion.
We're also going
yeah.
to be looking at a lot of other zoning changes to potentially allow increased density in this area for projects that could, increase the feasibility of those types of projects.
That was something that we found when we got into this. It's like pulling the yarn on the sweater. It's just like, where do we put the boundaries around this work? Because this ordinance, it interacts with zoning in so many different ways. And what are the elements of this that are most appropriate for design, and what are the elements that are most appropriate for updated zoning is something we've been wrestling with almost on every one of these standards. It's kind of like a key question we ask as this was being developed. So I think we're at the point where we have narrowed it down, and we do know that there's going to be an updated ordinance, but also this kind of companion piece or the recommendations memo for like, here's a bunch of other stuff that we considered putting in design review, but probably should be in zoning instead. And there's going to be a list of those. And what we're really coming down to is this handful of kind of key questions that we need to like get our arms around so that we can at least have it framed up in the design review ordinance, so that, over the next few months, this group, the design review group, and staff have a chance to like move some of those sliders around. Like, is the setback, we're going to put a setback in there, but is it 25 feet or 50 feet? And you can come up with that best number. But again, it kind of comes back to like the big concepts. We've got a lot of it, but there's still a few, and we've covered a lot of them tonight, but I still think there's probably just a couple more
Two
left.
Slides, yeah. So, should we keep going?
Yes.
All right. Demolition. Currently, the ordinance requires a 4-month notice for demolition of A or B buildings. During that 4-month period, the town may negotiate with property owners for an easement. There's not a lot of detail about what that means, but and then the PRB would have to vote to approve a demolition.
Point of clarification on that. Can the PRB actually deny a demolition request, though?
According to the ordinance, it seems
It's
like
on
it.
what basis?
I mean, it's
It's
sort of
not
like, yeah.
super clear in the current ordinance, which is why we're.
So we should definitely address that, because I think then it's like the example Caroline gave before. I mean, what we don't want is like somebody's like, well, I can't demolish it. I guess it's just going to fall apart. And then it
No, that's
demolishes
only the
itself, and it takes 50
3-month,
years.
yeah, right.
So we were looking at making this more clear. We set the potential at so the A and B buildings, which will be reclassified as contributing, we set that at a 3-month notice. The reason for the 3 months is just because with all the different town moving parts, sometimes depending on when someone submits something and then the town sends it to PR, having 3 months gives you just a little wiggle room to go through the full process. We would say that the 3-month delay can be waived if the part of the building to be demolished or the building is determined to not be historically significant. So that would be like if someone came in to demolish a later addition and they could go to the board and say, hey, I'd like to demolish this 1970s addition on my historic home, and I think you should waive the 3 months because this is clearly not original. Or if the building is structurally unsafe.
Right, but the only part of that seemed odd is the determined to not be historically significant, because we've already made these classifications, so why wouldn't that? And I get what you're saying about if it's an addition that's not part of what was
So
historically.
that would be so I've seen this in a previous town I worked with, a historic district, where someone came with that exact thing. They had a significant building, but they had a porch from the 70s. And when they came to the board and showed pictures, the board agreed, yes, that porch is from the 70s. You can demolish it. You don't need a demolition delay.
So explain to me how the town negotiates an easement in the 4-month period.
I don't exactly know because I've never seen it happen. I think the idea would be that the town could get a historic preservation easement, which is something that used to happen, but I have not seen happen anytime recently.
And what would they do with it?
Not let you demolish the building.
So are they buying this easement?
Right, yeah.
We're going to
Isn't
talk
this
more.
a taking?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a taking.
It's a purchased easement. We'll talk a little bit more about easements on the next slide because there's a whole section about easements in the current ordinance, and the future of them is a little uncertain. I would like, if someone wants to speak about demolition.
Go for it, Eric.
Oh, good.
Hi, Eric Smith, Director of Freeport Historical Society. Just to give you an example of, to your question, Mitch, how that might happen, because the determinations are made by parcel, they're not made by individual building. So very recent example that you may be familiar with, right on the corner of Bow Street, as in the Bow in Bow Street, there was an outbuilding that was classified as a B building because the house is a B building, but it's a separate structure. And it was therefore subject to a 4-month delay.
That's the way that it's a building, not a part of a building, and still not historically.
Yes. And it has now been taken down, and it's been replaced by a lovely new building on the same footprint. And while it was questionable, that outbuilding did have originally some historic significance. If you went in, you could tell the roof had been replaced, the sills had been replaced, most of the walls had been replaced, most of the windows had been replaced. So there was not much left of that historic original outbuilding, and it wasn't worth the process of trying to move it somewhere else in order to save it.
Thank you.
So we're back to the easement, and on what basis?
I think Ford left. Ford would know more about historic easements than I do.
I could also speak to the easement. I know the easement's going to come up on the next slide.
Yeah.
Because and I think the question about it is, it's been reserved as the right for the town to negotiate an easement, which could be purchased. But it is essentially an interest in the building that you are buying out. so that
gives
the
the
owner
time-
of the building, whoever the owner of the building is, no longer has the right to demolish it.
But it'd
And
be his
also-
choice to accept that deal.
Yep.
The town,
Correct.
this gives the town the time to make a deal
Yep,
that the
just-
guy
just
says
like
yes
a land
to.
just like a conservation
Okay,
easement
that's
on a piece
fine.
of property, you negotiate with the property owner and purchase
Okay.
it.
And the town, as far as we know, does not currently own any historic preservation easements. However, historic preservation easements are negotiated by other entities outside the town. So the State Office of Historic Preservation often holds conservation easements on properties, particularly if they have been the recipient of funds to restore them, to ensure that they're not restored and then sold and then demolished. Maine Preservation, as an organization, would also do this, and in that case, they would do annual inspections to make sure the upkeep is maintaining that historic standard. So there is a reason why the town might negotiate it. It also may not be the town that takes on that easement. It could be another entity.
Okay, so that brings us to the fourth point, right? I mean, that solves that problem?
Yep, so.
I mean, it's just an optional thing that gives the town time to make
Exactly,
a
to
deal if
negotiate.
the home, so I don't think anybody's gonna object to.
And then,
So should it not say town, should it say other entity may negotiate?
Yeah,
easement? Instead of town?
Town
Some
or
entity?
other entity, and other
I mean,
entities, I
why,
guess.
if you're gonna keep this, why limit it to the town?
Right,
yep,
Eric
we
just
can make it
explained.
clear that it can be another
So,
entity.
yeah. But now the next one is the troubling one, because without a historic preservation ordinance, on what basis can the PRB say no? Let's just say I have a beautiful building, it's a shame to tear it down, but I'm determined, and I wait my 4 months, and the town makes me a deal, and I say no. Can I not tear it down because they say no? And on what basis?
I think that one of the things that we're suggesting to put in here, which is not exactly answering your question, but to say that you can't demolish a contributing building unless you have redevelopment plans for the property, it's not quite answering your question, but instead, it's saying like you can't just demolish your building because you feel like it. Like you have to have a clear kind of path of how you're going to redevelop this property and why you need to demolish this building.
It's falling down, I don't want to repair it, I don't want to build anything, I'm going to sit, it's a bad market, I'm going to sell the property 5 years from now, but I don't want to deal with this anymore. I can't.
So I will
If you
say,
keep a-
so in a separate section, it does say, nothing in this ordinance shall prevent the construction, reconstruction, alteration, restoration, or demolition of any such feature which the code enforcement officer shall certify is required by the public safety because of an unsafe or
Yep, so we
dangerous condition.
say
Well, if it's not unsafe, it's just a money pit.
I'm
then
tired of it.
Yeah.
Or I'm living right next door and I got 2 houses and I want a bigger lawn.
Right.
I think that goes back to the question of why you have this ordinance altogether, is because there's a higher interest of the community than about this particular part of the town than just the individual landowner. So if you own a contributing building and you don't want to maintain it, you have the option to sell it. And the town has an interest, I think, as stated in this ordinance, the town has an interest in not having that building disappear from the landscape if it has been determined to be contributing to the historic nature of the downtown.
So,
I think, one of the comments that came to mind earlier for me when we were talking about vinyl, I think, and what are we doing here when we're placing these restrictions? Effectively, we are costing property owners in this district money, almost no matter, I mean, for me, like if I want to replace my windows, I got to pay a little fee to go to the town. I mean, that's pretty minor, but it costs me money, it costs me time and effort, and but at the same time, this ordinance has been in place for a long time, and I knew it was there when I bought my house. It was appealing to me in some ways when I bought my house, and so there's that choice there, and there is, like Eric said, there's that higher interest of maintaining a character in town. And so that is, I think, what makes me sort of okay with these restrictions and okay with the fact that, yeah, we are costing people a little bit more money because in general, people have made the choice to be here and they want to be here for some reason that this ordinance supports.
But then,
And I think, and then to Wayne's point about, affordable housing, like, of course, I hope that, the vinyl prohibition isn't the thing that tips an affordable housing project, capital A affordable housing project, maybe over the line. But at the same time, that's why I support keeping the design review district really tight. And so hopefully if it does, it's that it doesn't move far and there's another place for a project like that in town and it's not far away. But at the same time, we can maintain this like really tight part of town that has this level of review.
could I just ask two questions about this? One, so I appreciate what you just said. And if the town's interest is to not have these buildings torn down, then why would it be up to the PRB anyway? Why wouldn't it just say you can't do that on a contributing building unless with those exceptions?
So
Why make
Caroline
it a
has
judgment
informed
call?
me, I'm going to throw you under
Wait,
the
can I
bus.
ask my second question too, because they're slightly related, which is, there are historic buildings all over town. For one, although I am not that much in favor of this design ordinance, I am sort of interested in a historic preservation ordinance. And I don't know why we're applying this here, but not in South Freeport. So anyway, now go ahead.
She's up there now, so she can just say.
So I want to answer your question. Today in Freeport, Maine, we have a 4-month notice period for demolition. And it requires you to go to the PRB, present your materials, run some paper, add some papers, tell the PRB.
All
tell
over
the planning
town, all
board.
over town, if it's a,
We're talking just about design review today.
yeah, okay.
Inform the Historical Society, and if you do those things, they cannot say no. A lot of times, people come in and do it with projects. A lot of times, we see it split. They want to come, take the building down, clear the site, and then they'll come back for approval. But you have the right, and the PRB cannot say no. So what Kate's talking about here is a new standard, and it would be stricter and introducing some component of historic preservation, which is not something that we have talked about, because again, today you can take it down. The other thing, which I was waiting for Eric to mention, about giving a few months, is that one of the things that allows is, we have had buildings that have been moved and buildings that have been saved, that have gone other places. They can't all be saved, although people love to repurpose old wood now. But it does give the Historical Society or others chance to go in and photograph and document the building, which is something they like to do for their historical records. So I think one thing tonight is now the time we want to get more strict on this standard with regards to introducing a redevelopment requirement, even though you're proposing to shorten the timeline? Or are we going to talk about true historic preservation and preserving structures at a different time and a different grand scheme, possibly to go where Mitch is going?
How many times have we used a demolition permit in Freeport?
Quite a bit, actually. The PRB does use it. I'm going to get in trouble again. Sorry, Tom. We see it a lot for portions of buildings. For example,
Yeah, yeah.
on LL's house, they took
Sure,
off
sure, yeah.
the smoking room.
Yeah.
We've seen it for porches. Jason's neighbor just took down a barn and put up a garage. So
Yeah,
There's been a
but
couple.
not a whole, not too many whole buildings.
not in recent times that I can think of, but Eric might know that better off the top of his head than me.
So PRB did have to issue a demolition permit for that outbuilding that I just talked about. They had to issue a demolition permit for the part of El Bean that was just taken down. That was considered a separate building. That was a B-classed building. And again, there was not a lot of argument that that needed to come down for all kinds of reasons. It certainly wasn't going to be moved anywhere else, but they had to go through that delay. And there are reasons why. Again, one of the conditions currently is it has to be offered. If somebody wants to come in and move that at their own expense, that you essentially make that available. so that somebody could come in and take a house rather than it being demolished, which of course happened all over downtown decades ago. But that's one of the purposes of the delay currently. But to Caroline's point, the proposal here is that then you could actually say no and deny a demolition permit. And to answer your question, Mitch, that really is the reason why I'm here tonight, is to talk about the difference between design review and historic preservation, and the fact that we do not have a historic preservation ordinance in Freeport, which is a great concern to many people all over town, particularly folks in South Freeport, because of the high density of historic homes in that very clearly defined neighborhood, but in the other historic villages in Freeport as well, in Mass Landing and Porter's Landing. All of those, I think, are ripe for consideration. However, to your earlier point, that's also, to some extent, a taking. If you were to put that imposition newly on folks, that's going to be a big conversation for the town to have, but I think we're due for that conversation because you're talking about introducing restrictions in areas of town where there have not been.
This is talking about introducing a restriction, even where there already is a restriction, but this is a further restriction.
Exactly, and that's why I think, to your point, why this here and now, as
Because we're
opposed to
here
that.
now.
Because we're here, and that's the scope that
Yep.
North Star had, not to write a historic preservation ordinance, but to rewrite design review. And I think it goes to the point that right now we have no restrictions, even in the downtown, even though there's so much focus on keeping the downtown looking like its historic character. There is nothing that says somebody can't buy a historic building, put notice out for 4 months, and then tear it down. And this would stop that in an area where
And
we
it
already
creates a
have
model, I suppose, for a historic ordinance townwide in the
Yep.
future, if so.
Yeah, maybe not a model, but at least a toe in.
Yeah,
to
a
that.
toe in.
I think the idea with requiring a redevelopment plan is that there should be some bar for why you're demolishing a building besides unsafe buildings. This isn't saying, like, this isn't a super high bar, it's just saying you have to have some plan for the property that you're showing. So if the plan is that you want to knock it down and build a bigger house, that's a redevelopment plan. But that there should be some reason that you can show and some plan to have to kind of discourage people from just demolishing something and leaving an empty lot for all time.
But who would do that unless it was in their best interest, you know?
Right.
And I don't know if I like this, the way that this reads.
I just remember years ago, the building across the street that's made now was Linda Bean's Antique Shop. Dave McQuaid was living there. It was an apartment house. And he wanted to redevelop it into, I think, Mikasa at the time, moved in there first. And he got a hard time from the town, so we went out and took out a demolition permit and says, either we can make a deal and I can have my, deal, or I'm gonna knock the house down. And it was effective. He got what he wanted, and, and the town was negotiating very hard at the time. They were giving him a hard time, and he's like, no, this is my land, At least if the taxes are paid. I mean, if the taxes don't pay, you don't own it, but, so there's so many takings now. I mean, the things that we don't have anymore, we basically rent our house from the town. And, so there should be some.
Sort of true.
Of course it's true. It's a feudal system. We rent our land from the town. We don't own it anymore. Don't pay your taxes for a couple of years. You see how quick you're out in the street.
Jason has something.
What kind of incentive would the town, I mean, if the town's basically saying here that you can't tear down that building, we're not gonna let you do it, unless it's falling apart.
Or you're tearing it down for a reason, to redevelop the property.
The reason is it's costing money.
Yeah, I mean, that person needs to be able to get out of it. And if the town is not gonna be incentivized to give you a very good deal because, if there's.
They got you over the barrel.
Yeah, you're screwed.
But I think
the homeowner's screwed in this
the
situation.
counterpoint is, like, presumably if it's a contributing building, it's in this area that we've determined is, I mean, this goes way back, right? So hopefully we're
Up
not
for grabs,
renegotiating this
right.
part of it. But like, there's this tight area that we care about the character and we care about the visual compatibility. I know everybody hates that term, but you know, hopefully we know what we're talking about. Broadly speaking, we're trying to maintain a certain look to this part of town. Presumably, the contributing building contributes to that look, and so it can't be torn down without a reason. And I think it goes back to me, like, I'm sort of broadly okay with this draft. I like the shorter time period, and I like the sort of bar that you've set. Because if it's contributing, then yeah, there should be a reason, I think. And I think, again, like this, it goes to, you know, yes, there are private property rights, but also within reason, anybody who's buying or owns a place in this design review district, the design review district was there when, you know, it's been there for 30-something years now. So, like, they were aware of it. They know that it's there. They know that this part of town is regulated in this way. And so people should be coming into it.
Why wouldn't you just say you can't tear it down then, unless, because I'm still having trouble trying to figure out how the PRB is supposed to say on what basis we will
Yeah,
allow
that's-
you and not allow him.
I think that's fine. If the PRB wants to, I mean, if we remove the PRB vote from this and just have a barrier and a process.
Say you
Then-
can't unless, or I don't know, you know?
Well, I
mean,
think if
now
you just
can't
strike
and
the
can't.
PRB, if you strike the line that says PRB votes on demolition approval, or maybe the line says PRB, if there has to be a finding, like if, for the record, if maybe there needs to be a finding that says that this is appropriate, maybe the PRB just like approves the process.
What if they want to challenge their contributing designation?
There's a process for
There's a
that.
process for that.
Okay.
So you just put up vinyl all
So
over
you
your
just
house
say
first.
contribute, right.
Contributing, and then you tear it down. You might have to wait like 30 minutes.
People do
Drop a
things
match
like
on
that.
That's what's going to happen.
Jason has a comment.
I'll try not to be repetitive, but I think that the vacuum of time that this 4 or 3, however many months it is, creates is beneficial, and that something doesn't just have the opportunity to disappear overnight and become
Right.
a shock to the communal system. And which probably was reactionary to some of the shocks that happened in the 60s and tearing down really significant buildings, and you know, like how that played out over time on smaller and smaller scales.
What do you think about it going from 4 months to 3 months, though?
I mean, it seems fine. Like, you probably know pretty soon in that process,
Okay.
like if someone's going to come forward, and like Caroline said, some barn-esque type structures have been moved, and that worked out well. The Maycomber barn was basically falling over, so there really wasn't much of an opportunity in that sense. And I felt like he waited too long with that 4-month. But I also think like the LL Bean project, it didn't make any sense for them to wait almost any amount of time other than the shock to the system.
That's where I
part
think
of
a
it.
waiver is a good addition.
Right.
If everybody agrees that, okay, it's not historically significant, like, please proceed, that's a good, so.
Well, there should be some sort of process for the PRB to, you know, just.
That's what
override
the-
that or something.
Yeah, I
3-month
think
del-
in a case like that, on something of that magnitude, it would have been helpful for us to be able to say, we don't think that you need to go through these hoops.
Don't
All
confuse
right,
them.
do you have enough, do you guys have enough to go on?
We will bring
this?
forward a very specific
that-
demolition section, and we'll go from there, I
I
think.
think the sense, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the sense I'm getting it from the board overall is that the part of this that we have the biggest problem with is the notion that the PRB could just deny.
Yep. I'm getting, what I wrote down is that we need to come up with more specific criteria for
Unless
what
it's
the
on some
PRB's
clear
role is.
basis that they're checking.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll think about that more and bring it back to you. And then the last thing, which we kind of already talked about, is the historic easement provision. There is currently a section of the design review ordinance that says the town may acquire by purchase or donation historic easements. When we talked to staff about this, this has never been used, so we were.
But it might be used, we already talked about that. I
Yep,
just don't-
exactly. So
Why is it even here, though? If it's a maybe and you have a 3-month delay and the town decides to call up the owner and say, what do you think of this idea, or somebody else does?
So
what's-
this ordinance provision is giving the I guess it's a recommendation, so it's not really power, but it's telling the PRB that you have the power to recommend that the town purchases a historic preservation ordinance. Easement, sorry. So this is in here, this has never been used. Typically, as Eric explained, historic easements are not done by towns, they're done by other organizations. So I think we just wanted to kind of bring it forward and say, I think my initial instinct was we can leave it in there, but if it seems cleaner to take it out as it's never been used in the town.
I'd like to think it will be used, but I still don't know what it needs to be in there for, if it's all an optional negotiation during a waiting period.
Yeah, it's a little, I think in some ordinances, the language is a little stronger, where it like is connecting the power of the project review board to be part of this easement process, where this one is like a recommendation, may recommend, so it's a little.
Why not just put it in wherever it is that it has the delay? You could
Yeah,
put in a
that-
sentence, during this time, the PRB may choose to recommend, or.
It is in your draft.
I think it's already there, so that does it.
Yeah, I think we kind of talked about those two at once, so.
Yeah,
When in
I like
doubt,
that idea.
leave it out.
I mean, there's nothing, whether this is here or not, somebody could go negotiate one.
Yeah,
Didn't it say the town or other entities?
Yeah, town or
yeah,
other.
that's, yep.
Yep.
Have you seen any town purchase a historic easement?
I don't know of any town that has. I know of other, like Eric said, Maine Preservation, Greater Portland Landmarks in Portland in like the 70s.
That's what I mean,
and
but
80s,
not
bought a bunch of them, but
not
I've
a
never seen a
municipality.
town do it.
And I think that would be a pretty controversial use of taxpayer money.
Yes.
These were a lot more common in like the 70s and 80s when there were a lot of municipalities where property was cheaper.
Yeah. Is it the section that gives the town the right to do that, or is that elsewhere?
This is the section currently, so we can
I
incorporate
wouldn't-
that into
I
demo.
wouldn't be in favor of the town having that right to do that.
Right.
You mean like you would want to see like a.
Like if a private organization wants to do it, that's fine, but
Right.
if no private organization cares and the town, for whatever reason, decides they want to spend taxpayer money on preserving a building, I'm not in favor of that.
But that's why we have a council that is, a representative, so like presumably.
You can't count on the council.
I guess
to
where I would come
taxpayer
down on
interests.
this,
Oh, that's for sure.
what I'm hearing generally is like the option ought to be there, but it shouldn't be required. And I see it as like outside of the planning board's.
That's why I was saying it's outside of the scope of this document, because
Maybe we should just take it out.
just take it out.
I would just I think we take this out, but we make it clear that this sort of thing could, I'm not opposed to that sentence being in the draft like it is, like
Yeah,
this
keep it.
sort of thing could happen. I also don't think the planning board needs to preclude the town from purchasing a historic easement.
We'd be creating the right for the town, because Kate just said that it doesn't exist elsewhere. This is what gives the town that right. So we're creating that right, which I don't think we should do.
Well, they also can receive it by donation, I see.
Yep.
So why
Yeah,
can't
well, that
that
would be
be?
fine.
Okay,
Yeah,
great. So why don't
But we don't
leave-
need this, we don't need that language to do it.
We
You
can
have the waiting period. Let anybody act during, if you need a 4-month waiting period because you need people to act.
You guys have enough to go on.
I think we do.
it's-
We'll incorporate it into demo delay.
Good. Next item.
Anybody can go to the town and say, "Hey,
Campgrounds.
I don't want to tear my
Well-
house down, why don't you buy it?"
Congratulations, everyone. You made it through all the questions.
This is really good, and we really did save the stickiest kind of questions for this group, and I think it's good to get that direction so that we will be bringing something back that reflects more or less the consensus of the discussion.
I just had one quick thing going back to the vinyl and affordable housing. David said something that I don't think anybody responded to, which I liked, which was, how about a waiver limited to an affordable housing project, waiving the vinyl thing? So, limited to that circumstance, just in case that happens and it has to be in the design review area, that would be a good thing to be able to handle.
How do you feel about that waiver?
I think if it's specific and
Not a
spelled
waiver,
out,
It's part of the
Yeah.
zoning. It's part of the
I
ordinance.
think it's a lot more clear. You know, my issue with waivers in general is when it's not clear and there aren't set parameters, and then it becomes a, well, you did that for them, but not for me type situation. I think,
But there are other ordinances that specifically address affordable housing, so.
yeah, we have
That'd be
affordable housing
appropriate.
developments are a specific land
Right.
use.
But here, this might be an appropriate carve-out for that particular use.
Yeah, if that's something the board wants to explore, I think that's, I think that's fine.
Yeah, would that go in the, I guess it would have to go in the design review ordinance.
If it's an affordable housing, then all of a sudden vinyl's allowed.
I think you would just cross-reference
I was
the
gonna say,
zoning
I think we could
ordinance to
probably-
the land use, the definition in the, yeah.
It might be more appropriate in the affordable housing. We can talk about it.
Yeah.
Either
I don't-
way.
Right, that's where I'm going, is like, I'm not, yeah, anyway.
Any one of those projects would use both ordinances, or, if it was one of those projects downtown, so.
It would be a capital A.
Why do we have downtown
Otherwise, there's no way to limit it. Anyway, all right, thank you, Kate, very much, and Ben. Thank you.
We'll see you in a few months.
All right, let's move on to item 3, which is a discussion of section 505 campgrounds of the zoning ordinance regarding the need to clarify the minimum land per campsite standard. Kyle, you want to get us going with a real high level on this?
Yeah, so this is an introductory conversation, so forwarded along as an attachment in your packet, the language of section 505 of our zoning ordinance for campgrounds. It's a really short section in our ordinance, but we do have a few campgrounds in town, and they will occasionally go to the project review board for site plan amendments, for changes or expansions or whatever it is. And so this is a little before my time here, but in kind of catching up on some of these things, I know at the PRB level, at the staff level, this ordinance just doesn't read very clear. So there's a state standard through licensing for campgrounds that requires site shall contain a minimum of 1,000 square feet for each RV and tent site, except that in areas subject to the Shoreline Zoning Act, there shall be a minimum of 5,000 square feet of suitable land for each site. So, we had reached out to our town attorney about, what's the proper way to interpret this, and basically they came back and said that, the ordinance isn't super clear, and whatever direction the town wants to go in, we should probably just pick a direction. So the two options of how to interpret this are basically that you could think of it as every campsite within a campground needing to draw like imaginary lot lines, like a subdivision would have lots, where each of those, camp lots has 5,000 square feet of land within those imaginary lot lines. So you have, a tent site with 5,000 square feet and then another one next to it, and so on. And then the other way to interpret it would be more of a net calculation, where you cluster the tent sites together or closer to each other, and you just take a net calculation where you're taking the total land area of the campground and then dividing that by the number of individual sites to make sure that, that net averages out to at least, currently our ordinance is 5,000 square feet.
And it would be not including roads, driveways, wetlands.
Right, and then there's this,
Just like in
land
subdivision, right? You have this
subtracting
sort of
out.
like steep slope,
Yep.
whatever else, unbuildable, yeah.
So,
You mean, wait, so your net density calculation would take out those things?
yeah, so you would be, right, using more of the open space.
Why would we do that?
Yeah.
Why would we what?
Take out those areas. I mean, we're talking about removing that stipulation from housing just here a while ago, when they came with, to increase the density in the housing, they were gonna take out, wasn't there a
I mean, I think
discussion on, steep
it's
slopes
sort
and
of,
stuff?
it's sort of like a impervious surface and environmental protection type of consideration
mean,
and
the-
trying to make sure that like if you don't have like spaghetti roads that are going all through every one of your lots, right? So you
No, but I'm just saying, if you're gonna deduct, steep slopes and stuff, I mean, if you got 5 acres, or you got 50 acres, whatever it is, why shouldn't you be able to divide 50 acres by,
yeah,
5,000?
the steep slope I think is a bad example. I didn't really mean that should apply.
You just meant roads.
I was just making the comparison to subdivisions. I think what's listed in the current section 505, roads, driveways, wetlands, and land below the normal high water line is a good list. Like those things to me should be deducted from.
It's basically saying you can't put a tent site on any of those things. Like you can't have a tent site.
Well,
in
that's
the
fine, but you should be able to calculate them in your number.
Question is, if you have 100, if the number's 1,000 feet, and you
So
have
I'd like to
100
come back to this part because there's a bigger conversation of whether, if we want to change, what's subtracted out of a net calculation, first we should decide if we want to go down the route of a net calculation versus creating these kind of imaginary
We do
lot
not
lines.
want to do that.
And, well, that's what I'm here for, is the feedback from the board. Because there are ordinances in the state that go in either direction. So it's pretty clear that
Everybody would have to survey every lot. It would be a nightmare.
So you don't necessarily have to do a survey because these aren't technically lots. It's not like we're creating a legal lot where the plan would go be recorded at the
How would you
registry of
even
deeds,
know?
but you would be drawing,
you would
lot lines
the
on
technical
a site plan.
The technical part of that is
To
pretty
show
easy.
the-
You would use just like, I mean, you would have to get the whole parcel surveyed at some point, like with boundaries, and then you get a scaled PDF and you just draw and make
you
sure that
figure it.
each line that you've drawn on your site plan or each boundary of each campsite can, bounds 5,000 square feet or more of land. So I think, before the discussion about what is and isn't included, we definitely need to make the determination of which direction do we want to go.
Yeah, so obviously the pro to a net approach is just like the pro in any sort of, like housing development or something, by clustering things together, you're able to more densely put things together, you're better to, it's more efficiently use the resources and infrastructure within the campground, you're not spreading out the sites as much, which means you don't have to extend the roads necessarily as far if that's the desire for the person doing the campground. Potentially protecting more open space land and natural areas and things like that.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to cluster things, but.
Right.
No, you don't
gives you the
have to, but
option.
it gives you the option, correct, yeah.
So I was curious about this, and I went on Google Earth and I measured as best I could with like a little perimeter drawing tool on Google Earth the size of some of the campsites at Wolf's Neck, just because you can kind of see them, like they're out in the open enough that you can sort of see. They're about 5,000 square feet. It's hard to say if that's because of this ordinance or like because they interpreted the ordinance in that sort of way where you have to draw, or just because that's the size that makes sense. It's a, I guess, chicken or egg question. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting data point. I definitely come down after a little bit of thought, but not too much, on the side of a net calculation. I think it's simpler for everybody. I think it gives the flexibility, and I feel about a lot of other things where, like, if a campground owner wants to design a campground, they're taking on a certain, if they design it and it's too tight, they do that at their own peril.
Right,
Like,
that's right,
we don't
exactly
need to
right.
be in the middle of that, so I think we allow the flexibility to the owners and designers and managers of campgrounds to lay out the campsites in a way that makes sense. And if nobody rents a certain campsite for 5 years because it's right next to the neighbor, then they're going to figure that out pretty quickly. Like, we don't need to be determining that for them. That's kind of my.
So go to your point there about Wolf's Neck over there. I was talking to a friend of mine today who helped to lay out another campground in Freeport. When they did their calculation, he said he thought it was 5,000. He says, if I'd have known this was 1,000, he says, I had a bunch of campsites lined up with a whole bunch of dog leg lots out behind, and it was sort of all over the place to get the 5,000 requirement.
Well, that's what
So
it
that's
is.
exactly what, I
So
called out.
he told me, he says, if I'd have known it was 1,000 square feet per campsite, and I could have calculated 5,000 square feet anywhere and made my campsites 1,000, he says, it would have been a whole different deal for me.
So two things. So the state requirement right now for the state licensing, it's 1,000 square feet and 5,000 square feet within the shoreland area. Our local.
That's still a net, isn't it?
Well, that's the question, is nobody really knows. Because some people, because it's not clear. So we need to make it clear.
So, but at the local level, whichever way you do it, we give this 5,000 square foot number, regardless if you're in the shoreland or not. So a separate question, aside from what we've already talked about, is if we should match the state requirement and drop that number from 5,000 to 1,000 square feet per site, whether it's a net calculation or the imaginary lots. Do we match the state where we say it's 1,000 square feet and then 5,000 square feet within the shoreland area? So it's another point I'd like.
That's probably why Wolf's Neck is
Or
5,000
feedback
square feet,
on.
because they're within the shoreline
Oh,
zone.
shoreline.
But, Andy, to your point, currently, like if we want to require someone under the current ordinance to draw out these lots, typically in a zoning ordinance, when you have like a subdivision, right, you have minimum width requirements, you have other sorts of requirements to determine that a lot is going to be normalized shape to it. You're not going to have some wacky configuration where everything's bunched together and then the lots branch out towards the back to capture enough land. Since this campground ordinance doesn't have any of those extra requirements in it, if we do interpret it, or we go down the path of doing the actual requiring the lot lines, then you'd probably want to introduce some further standards to make it clear that someone shouldn't be creating these, like crazy lots just to capture enough land, and, it would be a normalized lot.
I think I almost take a more or a different view of like, again, if a campground owner wants to lay out these, they're not really lots. If they want to do it on paper.
Sites.
Yeah. If they want to lay out these sites in a way that they think is commercially viable, as long as it meets the acreage that we determine,
Does anybody disagree with that? I mean,
But and then there's another part to me. I would think that C here on 505 campground. Yeah, we will. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So C section screening shall be required when necessary to shield the ground, which I'm assuming that means campground, from non-compatible abutting areas. To me, that's a bigger deal than the net residential calculation. In some ways, is like if you've got a campground and you've got some abutting properties, maybe you shouldn't be able to cluster the campground up against the abutting properties, and that has a much bigger impact than the net calculation. It's like, are you 200 feet from your abutters, or are you 50 feet from your abutters? Matters more than
Shielding?
like how big your campsites have to be based on. You know what I mean? So anyway, I guess my position is allow for more flexibility, and if we need to look at the buffer to make that more clear, then that's another potential while we're in this section 505.
I agree with what you said, Sam, but screening could be anything. What is screening?
Right, that's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Who knows? It doesn't make any sense
Yeah.
necessarily, so I think that needs some clarification.
Yeah.
But we do have a campground owner-operator here, I believe, right?
Some advice, Ted?
I'm a late life camp owner. Been 10 years at Cedar Havens and Freeport, which we're 2018 we were voted in as one of the 5 most awesome family campgrounds in the state of Maine, which was really good by a step outside. And we have, that campground's been there since 1965, and we just remodeled the bathrooms there lately this winter, and it was well long overdue. But campsites there are pretty close together. I think 5,000 is very huge. I think with motorhomes today, with the big buses that people can't, half them don't know how to drive them, or you can't even back them up, and you have to help them. Drive-throughs are wonderful, so you need a lot of land for that, and you try to incorporate that. The one thing is, you get extra money for what we call a premium site, which is a drive-through or a bigger site like a 5,000, that's considered premium. But we have a lot of Class Cs. They don't need 5,000.
What's a Class C, Ted?
Class C is a 20-footer, 30-footer with just 6 wheels, but a bus is a Prevost.
Yeah.
It's a Greyhound.
50 feet
I mean,
long.
it's 45, and they tow a truck behind them.
A Class C is
That's a
like,
Class A, excuse me.
and a Class C is like a
It's half the
like a
size.
camper van type of, or like a box truck size ish.
Like a mini
But
Winnie.
not a trailer. That's what I'm getting at. It's not a trailer. It's got a
We got Winnebago.
If you got a tow behind fifth wheel, those are pretty big.
Yep.
And, even at the dump station, we consider them differently because they have a 100-gallon septic tank on board that they dump into your leach field. And then the Class Cs are around 45, about half that. So we price them differently. And then we have the motorcycle guys that come in that just put up a pup tent. 1,000 square feet for them, they're happy. And I don't like to price them out, but if all I got is all I got is a 5,000 square feet and the guy's on a motorcycle, he's not going to pay the $67, $70 a night versus, you could get by with, $30 a night. And so you limit the owner to catering to the full public when you have all 5,000. I do like the idea that the average, so you can spread it out, and the square footage of the field that's over here that they all use together is nice. And we don't want to put them too close together as owners, because actually the old park is a little too close together in places, to be honest with you, because that started out as a tent, tent site place. They said years ago all it was tents and pull behinds. Yep. And the owners across the street, the old bakers, go, "Oh, you've ruined it." Well, what ruined it really wasn't that, but those same small sites now take bigger campers, Class C, which is a 24 or 30-footer, which is big compared to the 60s, and then now you got the 45-footers. So I think if you could average it somehow, and I think with all the space, that's better. And then, my engineers, Stevie Mahark, we talked about it, and we had it all drawn up. We came to you with 32 sites. And it was beautifully laid out, and I think it was great. But when you came with 50-foot setbacks from the neighbors, that takes a lot of land out of a guy that's trying to make a go at it. And I'm not saying that I can't afford to, but it does take a lot of land out of the picture. I could put a road in that, but I couldn't put a camper there. I don't think that's fair, the 25-foot setback. The 50-foot setback you have. I think 25 is nice, because you're trying to keep a covenant from the next-door neighbors. My next-door neighbors all love us, really. I'm lucky there, I think, for the most part. But I don't think it makes any difference when they're camping there. And I got to say another thing. We're a Christian campground. The streets are named after the fruits of the Spirit. When the sign says, "When you leave, may the Lord bless you and keep you until we meet again." And we're a quiet campground. You don't see any booze. It's a family campground. And we're very fortunate the Holy Spirit sends us really good customers. And people say, "Wow, it's so much better than," I won't say who, but this went up the road and that one over there. And I shouldn't even say the name of the town. But anyhow, they're nice campgrounds, but they are full of kids, and they're loud till 11 o'clock at night. And I'm going to tell you, you go in our place, even though we allow dogs, at 7:30 at night, it's quiet. I don't have any complaints from my neighbors, and that's a really good thing. But for size of the campsites, your average size, I think, is a little high at 5,000, especially if you're doing the average in there. And luckily, that's what, we did. But I came with 32. They're well-designed the system. I ended up with 22. That's kind of tough. You're trying to add all this expense and these big leach fields and the new wells and everything else. I'll be a long time getting my money back. 32 would have helped a lot more, and I don't think it would have hurt to have 32. I'm living with it, but your restrictions were tough to live with. I got to tell you right now, it almost made me feel like, ooh, I don't know. I'm lucky I'm a contractor, and I still like to work, and I'm almost 76 years old, and I'm doing a lot of the work myself. And I have guys in there now doing it and hauling my own material, which I don't know if I could afford to have done it and waited that long if I was a private developer at 5,000 square feet. And 50-foot setbacks, I think, are outrageous.
So what would make your calculations work in this ordinance? What changes would make your calculations work better? You say you came in with 32.
You know, I beg to differ. I've been over to Wolf's Neck, and the campsites down there on the shore that are lumped together, clumped together. I don't think they're 5,000. That's more like 3,500. They're not 5,000 square feet.
Some of them, yeah. So I mean,
Some of them going in on this place where you have campers, they don't have full hookups there. They send them to us.
well, I think it depends. I was trying to
So
measure
it's a
it.
whole different ball of wax when you're talking tenters. And the tenters down on the shore, those things are a couple thousand square feet, the max. So I think we need to consider the tenter with a motorcycle or a little pop-up compared to the Class C, and the 5,000. And if you want to say 5,000 for the Class A's, I can live with 10 of those or something, but I think 33,000, would be well, in my perspective. But that 50-foot setback hurt me a little bit.
So I want to get at
I was hoping to have a road down the center of this narrow part with that 50-foot setback. Oh, I couldn't put nothing on it, no tenders, but I can put a road on it.
Yeah, doesn't make much sense, does it?
Well, I want to get at a couple of things here.
I would have loved to
have
have the road in the middle of that sliver of land I had, because then it cost me a lot of money to put a road through it. I can only put campers on one side of it. It would share the expense of that road if I could put it on both sides. But because of that 50-foot setback, it really...
And you could
Let's let Kyle give a couple of responses.
So I just want to
Thank
say,
you.
on the setback point, that's the setback for the district, so that's not specific to campgrounds. So if, we want to start getting into setback.
It's a rural area.
Yeah, that
It has to be 50 feet.
I mean,
I didn't realize that. I thought it was campgrounds, but 50-foot setbacks is...
Yeah, in the RR1 district, so that
Okay.
applies to like
All right,
single-family
my
homes
apologies.
even. And
My
so, I
apologies.
mean, if at some point we wanted to address setbacks in the rural zones, like, that's something we can, but it's not specifically part of the campground.
My apologies.
Yep,
In
that's fine.
Brunswick, where I am, it's all...
So did you have to put the road and then
less than
50 feet from the other side of the road?
No, you can,
The
no,
road-
that 50-foot, you were allowable to put roads in it, but you couldn't put campsites.
Oh, I see. Did you put your road in the setback?
Had to.
Well, this is
I had no choice.
it's worth clarifying, right? Like, this is a very particular, it's a very narrow sliver, right?
It's
that
narrow.
connects to another.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So I think it's as much a product of that particular piece of land.
I
as
just
it
want to
is-
share with you tonight some
Yeah.
of the stresses.
Totally, no, and we always appreciate that.
Of the expenses,
Yep.
and how it's hard for, I don't know how young people would make it today if they just had reliable on their campsite money to pay for all this.
Yeah.
So
Wait, hold on. Sorry, Andrew, because Kyle, I want to let Kyle finish before we.
Yeah, so a couple other things. On the talk about, subtracting out like roads and things like that from so I just brought up the state rules. So that actually comes from the state rules. So whether we went to, imaginary lots for the sites or a net calculation, I don't think we could get away from subtracting out the roads from the calculation, because that's built into the state licensing anyway. But where we could change is this idea of moving the 5,000 square foot requirement per site down to as low as 1,000, because that's what the state allows, which would allow for, I think, way more density within the campgrounds to go from,
Well, I couldn't put a Class A camper in 1,000 for a Class C.
Yeah.
And nobody's
It really just
required
gives
that.
the option.
Well, it gives you the option to have a spread of,
Yeah, so my question is, who are we protecting by not going down to the state 1,000? I mean, why should we be more restrictive?
That's right.
Not
I say we dump
really
it to 1,000.
Yeah, me too.
Let the campground arrange, if he doesn't do a good campground, nobody will go.
That's
So,
right.
That's kind of my original
Yeah.
comment.
And the idea would just be that the 5,000 still applies in the shoreland areas, just like we have, because of shoreland zoning in
protect
general.
the
we have
shoreland.
Larger lot sizes for,
But it would
right-
still be a net 5,000, so they could have some 3,000s.
Yeah.
They just have to account for 5,000 square feet somewhere on that lot that goes with that,
Correct.
Some-
If that's,
it could
if
be-
that's
it
the
could be
direction the
open
board wants to go in,
space.
yes.
in the shoreland, because we have to anyways.
But I think that's the question is like, if we're okay with going to 1,000, are we okay with going to like, just imagine you've got a big rectangular parcel. You take your 50-foot setback out around the edges. Are we okay with carving up everything else into 1,000 square foot, in the most extreme case, into 1,000 square foot campsites? Or does the board feel like somebody could cluster a series of 1,000 square foot campsites in the middle, and that might be appropriate, but they need to make up for it somewhere else, sort of like an open space subdivision where the acreage needs to be there on the parcel.
Just put it all in perspective. 1,000 square feet is 31 feet by 31 feet.
That's not very
It's
big.
not a very big.
It's not very
place.
big.
That's a motorcycle site.
You know, so, you know, that's pretty small.
It's not very big.
Bigger than my apartment.
Like I said, I came with 32 sites, and I thought it wasn't that.
How many acres? How big was it?
4.7. I came with 32 sites, and I'm not utilizing all. One's leach field, a lot of settling ponds, and all this average stuff, but it's green space. It's not going to be flooded all the time. It's kind of nice. I do like some of the openness, but I think I would have much rather had 32 sites than I would have 22. But because when you add on all the restrictions and that 5,000, I came back with 22. And that was averaged. That was an average on the thing. And I think that's a good way to do it with the average. I don't say that you got to show every single lot. I think you take the acreage and you divide it up and you do your thing.
Some are big, some are
I
little.
think 3,000 would be a little more happy to work with.
So if we cut it
And
in
I don't think I would have done less than that because I wanted my customers to be happy too. I don't want to on top of each other.
So that's where I think, like, if we allow a net calculation and the 1,000 square feet, like, that's very dense. I mean,
That's very
again,
dense.
I guess I'm sort of going back on my own thing, like, at your own peril, right? But I think a middle ground is probably fine, where we'd say maybe 3,000
Yeah,
in.
just cut it in half, 2,500.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And a net calculation, and let's be done with this conversation.
Yeah.
Wait, so Fred, can you, sorry to be a stickler.
We spent a lot of time debating what the language really says, so I think we just want clarity. So if you're suggesting 2,500 feet, or what was the suggestion you got?
So I think the suggestion was 2,500 square feet
So
per
is-
site and a net calculation. So it would be taking the total land
You
of the
can't have
campground.
both, right?
No, you can't have
2,500
both.
per site.
Yes, you
No, it's a 2,500 net calculation.
So it's
So you just-
2,500, so it's just like our
it's not
land
per
area per dwelling requirement with like multifamily housing, right? So in any district, you have a minimum lot requirement that says how much land you need for the whole site to be a legal parcel. But then you have a lot area per dwelling requirement that says, you need X amount of land per dwelling unit. So this would be similar in saying that, in the RR1, you have a couple acre minimum lot size to create your legal lot, but then it's saying per site, you need 2,500 square feet. And that's just determined, that net calculation, by dividing the total acreage of the site divided by the number of campsites proposed.
So that, to me, that's not per site. You're saying on average,
Yeah.
we need to have 2,500. You could have a 10,000 and a 500, whatever the math
Correct.
works out
That's
to
right.
be.
That's
So just, all I'm suggesting, I don't have an opinion on what it should be,
Just
but
be
I'm saying,
clear.
give very specific clarity, because we must have spent an hour and a half one night trying to decide what the current language says. Where you're leading us right now is saying it's, from us interpreting, be clear.
Is the state rule clear to you?
Which was, I think
It's not any clearer than ours.
It's not that clear. No, I mean, I think a lot of towns just took the language from the state, which is why it is what it is.
Yeah.
I think we can.
Does that make sense? And again, no opinion on what the size number should be, just be precise.
We can put the idea of the net calculation and define what that is into the ordinance language
Okay.
to call out how it's calculated.
I'm still wondering why we want to be more restrictive from the state. Who are we protecting with this?
Yeah, I mean, that's, whether we want to go to 2,500 or 1,000 or keep it at 5,000, that's really up for the board.
I would suggest 1,000.
I'll go for that.
I would suggest something like 2,500. I mean, it's still a lot more sites than you are able to get right now, right?
Twice as
Twice as many, and then that gives you the ability to, to have various size sites for different groups. I mean, I suppose if you're planning a campsite for just tenters here or something like that, 30 by 30, one after another, after another, after another, after another, might be great for some people. It wouldn't be very much fun for me.
Right, but we don't have to go there.
Right.
That's why I'm wondering, who are we
What's
protecting?
our, what are we?
As Sam said, They do it at their own peril if it's not a popular or attractive feature.
If it's not a good campground, they won't get any business. That's really not the town's problem.
So, I mean, there are performance standards. Like, the obvious
challenge problem is-
concern that comes up would be like an environmental concern. Like, what's the impact on the land, right? So then, I think the question is what other impacts or what other protections rather are there? And I'm assuming this is subject to site plan review, right? So like, if the whole thing, there's probably a max impervious surface calculation, right? So I think, I guess I'm not opposed to lowering it to 1,000 square feet. I think in practice, you would never get there.
No, nobody's going to build one.
So yeah, you maybe there's no harm in just putting 1,000 square feet and just leaving it up to the campground owner. I think there's going to be impervious surfaces. There's going to be stormwater considerations.
He's got to have a
potentially.
septic tank and his
Yeah,
dump
there's gotta be-
stations
right.
and all, and his
There's-
bathrooms and all that
There's
stuff
got to be
gets taken out of
wastewater.
the
There's got to
campground.
Right, but we don't have data here to say 1,000 is not good and 2,500 works for the environmental aspects of it. So I would just piggyback on the state because, again, we're not identifying any reason to be more restrictive.
Yeah.
Are those performance? Am I right about that interpretation, Kyle? That there are those sorts of performance standards associated with?
Right, I mean, it falls under, campgrounds would fall under site plan review, so all of those findings that the board generally makes around utilities and stormwater and, that all still applies. Yep.
Is anybody opposed to just lowering to Matt?
No.
All right, great. Let's
I'm not
move on.
opposed. Let's go.
Okay, so to recap, we will lower to 1,000 square feet out of the shoreland, keep the 5,000 square feet in the shoreland. We'll clarify that it's a net calculation and define that clearly, so the PRB has good guidance on how to use that going forward. And then, so we should be able to bring back this draft next month. Would the board be ready to do a public hearing on this next month without any further discussion?
Yep.
What about the screening? Let's see. We should clarify that.
Let me pull it back up.
Yeah, at the very least, it shouldn't say
It should.
ground.
So screening shall be required when necessary to shield.
Yeah, I didn't know what the ground meant either.
I think it's supposed to say campground. I think that the intent, as I read it anyway, take that for what you will, but it's the point is to protect abutters. So like somebody with a single-family house next to a campground.
Yeah, and I will say that the board, like in other projects, has put in buffering requirements when the campgrounds have come back for site plan amendments. So that's a common thing that they use as campgrounds start to, the sites start to get close enough to a property line where an abutter might be able to see in.
Right.
The board has put in those conditions in the past. So I can just clarify that it's campground and not ground.
Is there a waiver on that screening? Can the abutting neighbor show up and say, I don't care if there's screening there or not?
I think it's up to the board to determine what adequate screening is. So I think, if people were comfortable with, existing vegetation along the property line and there was nothing else to put in because what was there was already adequate, then that's fine.
Also, it says when necessary, so there's plenty of wiggle room for that reason.
I think I would say, if I were going to wordsmith this, just super quick, non-compatible abutting areas is like not a useful way to describe.
no,
I would just say like, abutting uses or.
Yeah, just take out non-compatible.
Or just abutters.
Yeah, just take out non-compatible. That
Yeah,
doesn't
I
make
mean,
much sense.
It doesn't make sense. What's not compatible with a campground? I don't know. Anything, nothing,
Yep.
Sure, yeah.
Well, we're right next to a housing development, at Cedar Havens. And what was there originally was a 6-foot stockade fence, which we maintain. And it seems to work. I mean, everybody's happy with that little 6-footer there. We put silhouettes on it and stuff to make it on our side look at moose and stuff. But the neighbor next to us on the right in the new addition, which is Scott and
Poulin.
anyhow, my next door neighbor and the other one across the street, I went to both of them and said, "What'd you like?" And so we're going to put in like a 6-foot berm, put some trees on top of it or flowers, whatever they want. And that's all in part of the negotiation. But now Scott has said he just wants it so he doesn't have any lights going in his bedroom. So we kind of reduced it, but you left it up to us to make amends with the neighbors and work out something with them that works, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing. I think our charge
It
is
seems
just
to work.
what
To make
happens when
sure
it,
that
what happens when we don't have great stewards of the background.
You want to be good neighbors. I mean, you're
Right.
going to be there
Yes.
forever.
And it's great for us that most people do.
Can I ask one more question? When we talk about the shoreline zoning and the campgrounds of 5,000 square feet, is that for the first 250 feet? So if it's 250 feet back from the shoreline, then they're into the 1,000 square feet? Is that how that works, or is it the whole lot that abuts the shoreline?
No. It's just the portion of the lot in the shoreland area.
Okay,
So
thank you.
that's setback from, with the wetland or the.
Yep, gotcha.
Right, because the shoreline zone, like if, in its broadest conception, the shoreline zone is a overlay that is 250 feet from any,
Back from the high water or whatever we've decided.
Okay.
Great.
What did I do with the agenda? Sorry, getting used to my new digital life here. Item number 4.
We've got big items
discussion-
left.
Discussion of, we do have big items left. And it is
So,
nearly 9
I will
o'clock.
say, in the planning board rules, once we hit 9, the board has the ability to table
Yep.
onto the next meeting, and I think there's a hard cutoff at 10. So just, these aren't.
Does that mean we're not allowed to table this next item
I think
until
you
9
probably
o'clock? Yeah.
Could, because it's probably going to go past 9.
They're both pretty robust
Yeah,
conversations.
they're both important conversations. These are both introductory conversations. No real work has been started here. So I don't think there's any harm in taking them up in June, especially since it's most likely that the design ordinance would come back, I think, in July to the board. So that
So
would
we
leave.
won't have that to deal
June-
with.
Yeah, we could have June to have.
That was a productive conversation.
There won't be any the comp plan, was
No,
just
the comp
the
plan's
implementation table.
Until probably August.
The issue was we were supposed to come up with our top priorities to start to plan for the future, which to some extent I think are somewhat self-evident. Can I ask one dumb question about the comp plan as I studied these action items? All those state items, they're not optional as written,
Correct, I think those have to go in as.
no matter what. Every town must say that they want 10% of new residential development to be affordable, as an example. I mean, it says seek to, so it's not super strong, but, and I get the goal, but there's a lot in there of state requirements. Oh, my gosh.
It's more sort of sign wayfinding, right? Or signposting, like the general direction that the state would like to see. Then it
Yes,
is
okay.
Binding
All
action.
right, then I'm not going to worry about them too much.
Yeah, so I think that 602, the site plan conversation is an important one. It's, I mean, you can look over the memo and see some of the things that are highlighted in there. I think it's called out in the comp plan and the dog bone report and the downtown vision is looking at some of our development review processes and finding ways for efficiency and streamlining. I think it's worth really taking our time with that one and having a good, productive conversation. I don't want to rush through that. So, yeah, if the board is interested in kind of basing the next meeting around those last 2 items, as well as the campground.
Can we
Draft,
table item 4 and then have you give a brief overview of, or Caroline or somebody, like kind of, we talked briefly about like a couple of different ways to structure the, like how to look at the C1 and the performance standards, and does that make sense as just like a kind of, just
What
a
are you
quick.
talking about? I'm completely lost.
Yeah, sorry. I'm thinking ahead to, okay. I'm making the assumption, which I feel like is a reasonable one, that a lot of the suggestions for high priority implementation table and strategy Like a lot of
You're
the
even
things-
on this subject. I didn't even know you were on this
Well,
subject.
yeah,
and
sorry. No,
not
I'm
the-
thinking about how to spend the last couple minutes of our night here, and I'm wondering if it's productive to make the assumption that a lot of us would like to see density and sort of housing forward priorities put up high on the list, and talk just briefly about how, like a couple of different ways that we might approach the timeline of those strategies, or like if we take one, like how we look at changing boundaries versus changing existing requirements in multiple zones, or how like the big picture of that project might look over the next 6 months. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so, talking about the comp plan and kind of implementation as we're starting to move into that world, right? The idea with number 5 was leading up to the comp plan adoption, we might have time at our meetings over the summer to tackle some like low-hanging fruit items, but knowing that there are a number of recommendations in the implementation table that are of a much larger scale. They're like complete zoning overhauls in some cases of some zoning districts. Like the C1, for instance, we've talked about. I called out in the memo, like multifamily housing is technically allowed, but it's just completely not feasible based on a whole number of factors. That's like a complete rewrite of that district, basically. It's not going to be something we can really tackle in a month or two. But something like, the board has talked about it, it's in the downtown vision, I think it might be in the dog bone, like expanding the building height allowance to allow for 5 floors on some parts of the VC1, like on Depot Street. Like that would be, as far as going into the ordinance and making a small change, that's a really, that's a pretty easy change from a text standpoint to just cross out, a number maybe and add a couple words to allow that. It might be a bigger conversation in terms of actually the substance of what it means, but that could be something we work on and prepare so when the comp plan's adopted, it's just ready to go and packaged up. So the whole idea with 5 was highlighting some of those types of things. If board members had other ideas of things we could start working on. But then the second part of that is how are we going to tackle, what we've heard is housing is clearly the most important, and doing a lot of the work to improve density and building heights and upzoning some of these areas in our growth areas. What's the best strategy going forward of tackling some of these areas? To what Sam was saying, are we going to look at one change at a time? Do we want to look at a group of town, maybe a few zoning districts, and tackle a whole bunch of changes within that kind of geography? Or do we want to, take a look at the whole stretch of our growth areas, basically, and just kind of go back, take some time, and rewrite the whole kind of zoning code for that whole stretch of land for the town, and then come back with a draft that just changes everything kind of all at once? So I think it's something we need to start thinking about and having some conversations. And I think Brett is already working on outlining how some of that might line up for council. So it could be something that we bring to the board as well to get some feedback on. But we need to start thinking about like real implementation strategy of the best way and how the board would prefer kind of tackling a bunch of these.
Yeah,
Yep.
I'm sorry.
Go
I talked too much. First of all, you guys weren't all at the housing workshop that the town council put on? You were.
I was, yes.
But not the rest of the team here.
Correct.
So it's worth just mentioning that, so there was a workshop on the town council and the housing work, for whatever that work group. And we got into the whole conversation about should we be piecemeal fixing the zoning or fixing it en masse? And everybody feels like it's broken and a mess, and it would be great to fix it all at once, but the problem with fixing it all at once is it's a much bigger project, and it delays anything happening. So with that said, and I don't know the answer to that, it'd be good group discussion, but my next question is, in the dog bone plan and in the downtown vision plan, I would like to see the delta between what those plans call for and what the current zoning allows. And if we could just get a list of that, I think we also heard from the group that even though C1 is in the growth area and that area on Desert Road might be in the growth area, that everybody wants to concentrate first on how do we build out the downtown and the dog bone area. So
my counterpoint
what
to
do we
that,
do to that?
I'm not saying that that's wrong, and if we want to start there, that's fine. So the only counter to that I would bring up is that I think in a lot of our downtown zones, for instance, especially the VC1, right, there's already a decent amount allowed. And for instance, the C1, the C3 are really falling behind, and it's almost impossible to do anything anyone is interested in doing in those districts. So while I agree that the downtown, I think, has been a higher focus point overall and kind of the biggest area that people pay attention to and want to see things, I do think changes in some of those other areas, more south, in those kind of bottom two growth areas, could have bigger immediate impacts than changes downtown. Because the downtown, like we've seen a number of projects approved downtown, they might not have gotten built, but it is possible, with the 0 land per dwelling in the VC1, a 45-foot building height, if we were to look at that building height, kind of as a first step to fix that piece. So it's just something to consider.
Yeah, we heard in some of the public outreach on the comp plan, we heard, well, we want to prioritize downtown from the public too, but I think we have to remember that the town and the planning board we're not developers. We don't get to decide where this stuff happens. We just have to sort of set the table. And so I think Kyle's point is a really good one. If we can lower the barriers and have a bigger short-term impact by focusing somewhere else, then.
So that's interesting. But if you lower the barriers across all of the growth areas, it's also probably more efficient to think about it all together. But the likelihood is you'll get that parcel across from Cross Tree would be the first parcel that would be developed, not downtown, not C1. And so,
I also think we're looking at different types of, I don't know if you want to weigh in a second, Colin, but I think when we hear people come in and they're interested in developing projects, the projects we're hearing, someone interested downtown and someone who might be interested in the C1 are two different types of projects. So I don't necessarily think, if you
one
upzone
precludes
C1,
the other.
right,
I got it.
If you upzone the C1, I don't think
Okay.
the people who are going to develop downtown are immediately going to go take that project, because it's a totally different scale and type of building.
I just wanted to mention some of the different plans. So I think you have the comp plan implementation table in front of you. We've heard from the entire community and a lot of stakeholders, and there is a lot of overlap with some of these other plans and pieces of work. One of the things the council is going to be doing is we do have all these other documents. We have a downtown vision plan, we have a dog bone report, we have a housing committee report, and recommendations, and we have a climate action plan. And the council has received those reports, but has not forwarded actions on to each board and committee at this point in time. So they're going to be having a discussion on their goals, and part of that's going to be all these documents they have in front of them and picking, top priorities to send out to board and committees. So I think you might see some of that come in, but before I think it's really important to not focus on all the other reports, because it can make your head spin because there's so many right now, and focusing on this table in front of you, balancing everything you've heard over the last 18 months in the comp plan, and coming up with a
This
diversity.
does really include everything from all the other
Yeah.
plans.
Yeah, yeah. it does
Except,
in its own
except if
way.
you get at a very specific level and you say, what can we do? You may find, I just know that the downtown vision plan had pages of
Yeah, I think
zoning
there was like
changes.
80 or something. I think the other.
Zoning, but even on the zoning, maybe that was 8 pages of zoning changes.
Yeah, actually, when I went through the downtown vision to see what actually said, oh, this would be the planning board, the list actually wasn't as long as I thought it would be.
Yeah, it's really not that much. When it specifically calls out, like specific zoning changes, like it's really not.
We did some
Like,
of them too.
Yeah, and you talked about like streamlining the review process, the design review,
We hit a lot of the
the
low hanging fruit.
overlay. I do think Kyle had some good ideas too of some projects kind of in your calm before the storm right now, before we get the comp plan back and design review, things that there's probably staff capacity for, which is also good. I'm sure the PRB is going to be happy that you talked about some of the challenging ordinance language that they've had, but yeah, I think your plate is full, even if you just pick from this list and not all the other separate reports.
Yeah, so I think that's the thing. It's like, even regardless of what we decide to do once the plan's adopted and the strategy, whether we do a big kind of overhaul or piece by piece or something in between, over the next few months, I think we have the time and capacity to work on some of these kind of smaller changes that could be very impactful and be what's needed to spur a project and make a project go from not allowed to being feasible, but wouldn't take an immense amount of staff time and board time at the same time. So I think that's the immediate thing we want to talk about, and we could really dive into at the next meeting. And then we can kind of keep in the back of our mind the overall strategy of implementation for some of the bigger rezoning kind of concepts that are coming out of the comp plan and how we want to tackle that as we enter the fall and some of that. Things.
So, assuming we hear motions and seconds to table the remaining items, I guess we can hear from anyone wishing to address the board on non-agenda items. Seems pretty unlikely that we'll hear from anyone. Is there anyone on Zoom? There are a couple people, maybe.
No, I think it's just the town.
It's just the back end.
Brett's on Zoom.
Brett's already spoken to me.
I just wanted to mention for next time, I sent around, or Kyle sent around an article. So maybe we could reserve just a short amount of time for discussion of that next time.
Okay. And I would say on
They come out today.
602, so item number 4, I mean, Kyle, you put together a good staff report with several ideas. I mean, I don't know if you're going to have capacity between now and next meeting, but if you do, my personal opinion at least, and others can weigh in, but my personal opinion would be to let you run with some of those ideas and start to flesh them out a little bit and bring the board a proposal for a better process.
Yeah, I think with that one, I'd like to, I mean, one part of the reason we invited the PRB was part of that conversation, since they obviously use that ordinance a lot. So probably like to talk through some of that, just so, since this board doesn't often use site plan review, since you're not a development review board, just kind of walk through our existing process. And but since I will have a little more time, I might be able to flesh that out better in a presentation to make it a little more digestible, and then present some options there. And that way we can re-invite the PRB if they want to attend, and they have feedback on some of those. Because I do envision there being, every town's a little different when it comes to that stuff. It's not a set, this is the best way to do it. When you talk about the sketch plan meetings and having some things delegated to a staff board or, site walks, and there's a lot of options there. So I do think it's good to walk through and have a base level understanding before we dive into just looking at changes. But I can probably flesh out a little more than what we have with the extra time.
Okay. Do I hear a motion to table? I think I already did. I hear a motion from Andrew. Do I hear a second? Bonnie, all in favor, tabling items 4 and 5? Can we do that?
Yep. 4
and 5 together, great. Anyone wish to address the board on non-agenda items?
Oh, come on, Chalmers.
Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
And a second?
Second.
All in favor? All right. Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for sticking it out for 3 hours.